Good morning to you, St. Lucia. For those of you who are here at home, those of you in the diaspora, and for the wider world for tuning in to the Government Information Service National Television Network. I am Lisa Joseph. We're in downtown Castries at the Parliament of St. Lucia. The House of Assembly is meeting today, Tuesday, and just at the top of the hour at 10 a.m., we'll be expecting the arrival of the Speaker of the House, Honorable Claudius J. Francis, and of course the members of the House of Assembly will be seated and will be getting on with the day's business. And that is few bills are down for amendment. Two bills is the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Amendment and Consumer Protection Amendment. And of course, in keeping with the protocols established by the authorities for the management of the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic, and with a view to ensuring that the established protocols are met, members of the public are not being allowed in the chamber gallery during the sitting for today and on Thursday, which is the sitting of the Senate. And of course, the members of the public, as you are doing right now, can join us via the National Television Network NTN channel 122. We're also on the Government of St. Lucia Facebook and YouTube channels. So let me say good morning to Primus Hutchinson. And Primus, the daily order paper is fairly short today. As I said, we only have the two bills, the amendment for the drug prevention and misuse, and as well as for the consumer protection amendment. With the consumer protection amendment, Primus, it is something that members of the St. Lucia society has been looking forward to for several years, being able to get more consumer rights, the protection of those consumer rights. We'll be seeing several amendments to the consumer protection bill there, which will be enabling the fostering of those rights.
Yeah, this is very much so. We also have the Drug Prevention of Misuse Amendment, and in Section 8 of that Act, the bill is to change the quantity of cannabis or cannabis that is considered to be possession from 15 grams to 30 grams. Also, Clause 5 of the bill is added to the Act to make provision for treatment and programs for a child of young offenders. A new section is inserted in Clause 6 of the Act of the bill to provide for a restriction on smoking of cannabis in a public place.
Okay, and so I think we're just having some mic issues, Primus. If we just take the mic closer to you so that we're able to have some better audio being able to go out. And you know, as is customary, well, now it has almost become customary that we no longer have people in the gallery because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just for an overview of what's happening with us with COVID-19, we had the announcement of the extension of the COVID-19 protocols by the minister, and that has been proven to be very essential in the national fight against the COVID-19. The protocols really do go beyond just hand sanitizing, social distancing, and the wearing of the mask. These are very personal things that we can do to ensure our safety, our personal safety, and that of everyone else that we get into contact with. But there are protocols, there are measures that go beyond that deals with the collective, whether it be at the business establishment, within your work spaces and environments, the whole idea of commerce and how things move around. And so we have had from the Honorable Minister Moses Jean-Baptiste the announcement of the extension of protocols after discussion with stakeholders. It had been agreed that for the next 7 days we will be having these protocols. The current protocols remain in place. And so the extended protocols will commence Wednesday, September 15, 2021, and it will end on Tuesday, September 21st, 2021. So let's take a note of the curfew for Tuesday, that is today, and the curfew begins at 7 p.m. and ends at 4 a.m. So the COVID-19 protocols are as follows now. So let's pay close attention. The curfew is in effect from Monday to Friday from 7 p.m. and ends at 4 a.m. Saturday curfew starts at 4 p.m. and ends on 4 a.m. So this means that there will be a 24-hour curfew on Sunday. And on Primus, we've seen this happen for the last 2 Sundays. And I think now St. Lucians are perhaps getting into the stride of things. So we know that if we need to get out to the market, we need to go to the supermarket, need to just transact any sort of business on a Saturday, that things are going to shut down by 3 p.m. Business houses will close off at 3 p.m. to allow for the closure of the business and for the employees to be able to get home. And of course, we know that things are going to stop at 4 p.m. The curfew then begins, and then on Sunday we are all home with our families, right?
Very much so. Additionally, Lisa, there is also the suspension of the sale and disposal of intoxicating liquor at bars, rum shops, and restaurants. Also, the sale and disposal of intoxicating liquor from a supermarket, gas stations, or wholesale with a valid liquor license will be permitted. No consumption of intoxicating liquor will be permitted on license. Suspension of dining services at restaurants and food establishments, takeaway, grab and go, and delivery services will be permitted. Recreational social activities at hotels will be permitted on property during curfew hours, provided that such activities take place on property. Water sports and other water-related activities such as boat rides, skiing, etc., must be suspended during the 2-hour weekend curfew from Saturday 4 p.m. to Monday 4 a.m. During the period, the government of St. Lucia will meet with stakeholders and the newly reconstituted COVID-19 Management Center to review the COVID-19 situation and provide a further update on the protocols. The minister is asking all to continue adhering to the protocols to reduce transmission of the COVID-19 virus and return to some level of normalcy. So says the Minister for Health, the Honorable Moses Jabatis.
Yes, promise. And these protocols are exceedingly important for us to be able to flatten that curve, and we've heard that for the last 2 years about being able to flatten the curve, and it is extremely important for us to be able to follow these measures and play our part in order for us to be able to get COVID-19 under control. We know that COVID-19, it's a virus, it demands people to drive it, and so being able to curtail our social activities, social gatherings, while it may be wonderful to go celebrate your friend's birthday or some special occasion in the life of a loved one, I think now we perhaps primarily getting accustomed to the idea of doing everything virtually, and so maybe we could have birthday parties virtually.
Perhaps, yes.
You can do that.
Very much so.
So that we can just
to curtail the spread.
Curtail movement. So let's just look quickly, Primus, as we can see that the chamber is beginning to fill with members of the House. Let's look at what our numbers, where we are at right now with COVID-19 numbers. So overnight, or for Monday, September 13, 2021, we had confirmation from the Ministry of Health of 10 new cases of COVID-19. These are from samples that were processed on Sunday, and the sample was, we had 40 samples that were processed, and out of that we have 10 new cases. So that represents a positivity makeup of 25% of all the samples processed. And it now brings us to the active cases. But before I talk about active cases, we had the confirmation as well of 62 people recovering from COVID-19. This is always very good news. Our recovery always very good. So now this brings us to our active cases to 2,402. 5 of these active cases are in critical condition, and 10 of them are severely ill, and they are all at the respiratory hospital receiving the requisite care. So to date, we have 35,374 individuals who have received the first dose of the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. 28,669 have received their second dose. We have a total of 6,583 people who have received the first dose, and 77 individuals have received the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. Now today, vaccination is taking place at the V4 RC Roman Catholic Parish Hall, the Grosley Human Resource Center, the Larissus Constituency Council in Dennery, and the People's Discount Drug Store on Victoria Street, and that's by appointment only, Victoria Street in Castries. So from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. We're close to 10 a.m. now. So they've been out for an hour attending to these appointments until 4 o'clock this afternoon. So please go out, do your necessary checkups with your individual doctors, and make sure that everything is in order, that you understand all of the questions that you have to be answered about the COVID vaccine, and go out there and get yourself vaccinated. Thomas?
I think we might need to just inquire the brief over some.
Absolument. Nous nous pouvons dire ça quoi, Thomas?
Oui,
Vous disiez à bagay là?
on a regardé
Oui.
ministre de Santé, j'ai ajouté à ces règles-là, ces protocoles-là, commencé lundi pour vendredi depuis 7h jusqu'à 4h, c'était au soir, pour jusqu'à 4h bon matin, ça caille opération, que samedi, il a commencé à 4h, caille bout à lundi bon matin à 4h bon matin. Ça c'est 24 heures de temps curfew dimanche. Aussi, la vente boisson en pièces c'est cabaret, go cabaret, petit cabaret avec restaurant. Pièces vente pour boisson, qui fait seulement en supermarket, station pétrole, gas stations, et wholesale. Là, c'est ça qui a permission pour vendre alcool. D'abord, ni service là, ni un restaurant, et bien, en pièce établissement qui a vendu manger, ça ni pour faire c'est acheter et aller là même, pas ni pour rester en place là. Activité sociale en hôtel, ça fait seulement sur propriétaire, du Kofiwa, de l'éditeur Kofiwa. L'autre activité sur la mer, boat rise avec les autres comme ça va pas ni pour l'autre 24 heures de temps, ça c'est samedi les 4h après-midi pour lundi 4h bon matin. Le gouvernement c'est aussi qui je n'ai pris toutes les grands grecs pour ça faire une révision à cette situation et que y a plus d'informations sur ce protocole là ces jours pour venir. Le ministre de Santé a fait un appel pour tout le monde coopérer ensemble pour savoir battre mauvais maladie ça là.
We promise Mercy Musa. And also just to let you know that the Ministry of Health have been having several conversations with stakeholders, examining various collaborative ways in which the agencies can come together and to pool their efforts so that we can be able to have that turn for COVID-19, for us to be able to get a better handle, have those numbers come down, and certainly have more people recovering as well from COVID-19. And so just to let you know that the Ministry of Health has also indicated that they're working closely with the various minibus associations as well as the National Council on public transportation, as well and various members of the commercial sector as well, to strengthen their own measures to be able to see a reduction in the transmission of COVID-19. Let's just turn our attention, Primus, to the chamber. We can see that the members of parliament, they are now in the chamber. You could see the minister there for commerce, and as we indicated, that we will be having amendments to the consumer protection bill. And I can see her going through some papers there, standing there, Honorable Emma Hippolyte. Always very eager and raring to go. We can see that the Honorable Jeremiah Norva is in conversation there with Honorable Dr. Virginia Poyant. And I do believe seated there as well is Honorable Kenson. That's the Minister for Agriculture, Honorable Prosper. Station there with Honorable Dr. Virginia Albert Poyant, and the Minister for Education as well. Is also within the chamber, and the Speaker of the House is here. He's within conversation as well. He has just taken a seat, if I'm not mistaken, from your vantage point, which is a bit clearer than mine.
Yes, with the Attorney General.
He's in conversation with the Attorney General
and the
the
Deputy Prime Minister, the Dr. Hilaire. Lisa, he appears very casual. It doesn't look like they are prepared to start anything. And I think he would be fully in his regalia.
In his regalia at that time.
And so on, but he's not. So.
But I could only think that sometimes, that what understand various situations do present themselves, and it is always sort of situation. We just have to be ready to respond to whatever the situation may be, and we can see that the conversation looks rather intense, and that there may perhaps just be one or two little hurdles to be able to go through, and perhaps something to do with one of the bills. We don't know, but if anyone knows anything about the Honorable Claudius Francis, is that he's very thorough.
Stick to yourself.
Very, very thorough.
Oh yes, he is.
And he is going to pay attention to every minute detail to ensure that there is a smooth running of the House of Assembly. And so we are awaiting the commencement of the signaling of the things. But we can see, as I indicated, Primus, that the bills, and while people may simply think that the amendments are very, very, very critical, and especially when it comes for the consumer protection aspect, we've had the agencies like the National Consumer Association
been advocating
for years. For years, it's been advocating for stronger legislation.
But they've been rather reticent of late. I think I've heard from them in a while. I'm not sure.
I think, but they did have a very big part to play in being able to push for the requisite legislation.
This work, I must admit.
Yes. And I think too that, as with anything else, when you are dealing with a wide cross section of sectors, members of the society, it is not always very easy.
They'll have some challenges for sure.
For there to be consensus and an immediate consensus at that, Primus. And so I think that the work that has been done by organizations like the Consumer Association over the years, because remember, it's really on a twofold basis. You need it for you to educate and sensitize the public in order for them to understand what their own rights are. You need to have the business establishments, they too, to understand what their own rights are and how everything sits in the middle. So there has been tremendous work that has been done over the years with respect
we
to
just
that.
see the arrival of the the Prime Minister has just arrived, also accompanied by the Minister for Social Justice, the Honorable Kim Henry. So it appears that the House
will be convening, just perhaps 2 to 3 minutes away from convening, and with the arrival of the Prime Minister, Honorable Philip J. Pierre, we have seen the Speaker of the House, Honorable Claudius Francis. He's doing a quick exit,
yes,
and so that he can.
That signals that the House is
going to commence. And as I indicated earlier, you never know. You need to respond to things on the fly, as they would say.
Very much so.
And the work of the Prime Minister is never done. And so, while we saw all other members of the House, we had not seen him in chamber, and that can only tell us that he has dealing with other matters, because in the life of the Prime Minister, no one event is happening at any one time.
At any one time. It has never been this. It has never been so.
Right, and so, and for anyone who knows Honorable Philip Pierre, he, like the Honorable Speaker, he is someone who wants to pay particular attention, pay attention to the details, and certainly give that requisite due diligence to every matter that comes before him, and that is going to require him being absorbed for quite some time. The Deputy Prime Minister, Honorable Dr. Ernest Stiller, has been in here and perhaps, in conversation with the Prime Minister at this time.
Therefore, I exhort you, first of all, that supplications, prayer, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Let us pray. God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree judgment, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding, we thine unworthy servants here gathered together in thy name most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and to guide us in all our consultations. And grant that we have thy fear always before our eyes, and laid aside all private interest, prejudice, and partial affections. The result of all souls may be to the glory of thy blessed name. the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and the happiness of the public weal, peace, and tranquility of St. Lucia, and the uniting and knitting together of all hearts of persons and estates within the same in true Christian love and charity one towards another. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us now and forevermore. Amen.
Good morning, members, and thank you for being here. I have received correspondence from the member from Meekwood South advising of his inability of being here with us today. Statement from ministers. Prime Minister, Minister for Finance, Economic Development, and the Youth Economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Wednesday, August 25th, 2021, the Cabinet of Ministers and I, along with officials of St. Jude Hospital staff and the parliamentary representative for Vieux-Fort South, the Honorable Dr. Kenny Anthony, visited the site of the St. Jude Hospital Reconstruction Project, HRP, at Auger, Vieux-Fort. The delegation was given a guided tour of the active construction facility by officials of the main contractor and consultants associated with the project. We were appalled at what we discovered. I immediately realized why my request a couple of months earlier as leader of the opposition was so vigorously opposed by the then Minister of Economic Development. The new hospital wing or building under construction is far from completion. I mean, it is years away, despite the pronouncements by the then government that it was months from usage. Typical of the last administration's conduct, it was another public statement of untruths to the people of St. Lucia. Since that visit, I have been provided with a status report on the St. Jude Hospital Reconstruction Project from the Department of Economic Development. For ease of reference and to avoid the likely accusation of misquoting that report, I will quote directly from the report as far as possible. The report contains some significant statements. The cumulative expenditure on the St. Jude Hospital Reconstruction Project from site preparation, which commenced on February 2019 up to July 2021, amounts to 118.05 million. Of this amount, 89.3 million has been paid to date, leaving outstanding liabilities of 28.74 million. This means that the value of active contracts for works and services and consultancies performed amount to 28.74 million. The cumulative expenditure of 180.05 million has been incurred through a total of 14 contracts that have been signed by the government of St. Lucia and the various contractors, suppliers, consultants, and service providers. All these contracts were procured via direct purchase, approved by the Minister of Finance, meaning that there was no tendering process. Pursuant to the loan agreement between the government of St. Lucia and the Exim Bank of Taiwan in January 2020 for US 20 million or EC 53.76 million, the loan proceeds were to be made directly to the Overseas Engineering and Construction Company, OECC, which was designated the main contractor on the project. Accordingly, a Government of St. Lucia OECC contract was entered into for the full amount of US 20 million or EC 53.6 million to facilitate the OECC making payments to the subcontractor on the basis of completed and certified works. This unusual arrangement, in effect, relegated the OECC to paymasters for the de facto main contractor, Fresh Start Construction Company. OECC were never involved in the construction works at the St. Jude Hospital. The report continues. Given that designs had not been finalized and were being submitted to DCA on a phased basis, the project started without a final cost figure. However, even with an engineer's estimate based on design consultancy, the final costings could only be derived upon receipt of the priced bills of quantities from the contractor. In essence, there are no DCA-approved complete set of drawings for the project, which makes it impossible to arrive at a final cost figure for the structure under construction. In June 2021, in a desperate attempt to convince the people of St. Lucia, ahead of the general elections of July 26, 2021, the then Cabinet, by conclusion number 454 of 2021, stated, 1. Approval of rescoping of the St. Jude Hospital reconstruction project to bring the ground floor of the facility into use. And 2. Endorsement of the financing arrangement between the Government of St. Lucia and the contractor, details of which will be subject to approval of the Department of Finance. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that while members of the United Workers' Party were claiming that there would be a new hospital in 2 months, the then government had not even secured the finance to complete the ground floor as evidenced by the Cabinet conclusion. Mr. Speaker, the report from the Ministry of Economic Development states, and I quote, the cost of bringing the facility into use by operationalizing the ground floor, in keeping with the Cabinet conclusion, is 48.01 million. Let me repeat. The cost of getting the ground floor was 48.01 million. That's the ground floor only. Made up of 38.41 million in works, 8.6 million in consultancies, and 1 million in project management unit costs. This would bring the cumulative cost of the St. Jude Hospital with bottom floor only completed to 166 million without furniture, fixtures, and equipment. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind honorable members that in a document entitled a technical architectural proposal prepared on April 13, 2018, stated, it is conceivable that the proposed East Medical Wing, in conjunction with some buildings and functional spaces which have already attained practical completion, can be utilized in order to facilitate the earliest transfer of the most critical departments currently operating from the George Odlum Stadium. The cost was estimated at 26 million. The transfer of patients would take 12 months. Mr. Speaker, it is worthy to note that in January 2017, when the project was abandoned by the United Workers' Party, the following materials listed below were available for use on the St. Jude Hospital. Several of these payments had already been made. They paid 2 million, 2 million for the supply and installation of radiological equipment. No delivery was made by January 2017, but $2 million had been paid. An advance paid in the sum of $9 million for medical equipment. No equipment was delivered by January 27, but the amount had been paid. A firm was contracted to supply, assemble, and install furniture, equipment, medical gas lines, and a nurse call system. The contract was for $7.5 million, with the amount paid to date being $6.9 million, suggesting that a significant amount of the furniture and equipment would have arrived in St. Lucia by January 2017. A firm was paid $3.78 million for the supply of doors. No doors have been installed. An amount of $811,000 for the supply of paints. Only a small quantity of priming was supplied. Payments were made for the supply and installation of suspended ceiling, drywall ceiling, windows, and tiles. It is reasonable to assume that these materials were on site. An amount of $84,705 was paid for the supply and installation of stainless steel railing. So, Mr. Speaker, all these were available for inclusion in the East Wing. All these materials and all that equipment was available if the government had moved into the East Wing. The following materials were stored on site. 5 40-foot containers containing building materials. 1 40-foot container containing plumbing items ranging from faucets, toilets, and PVC pipes. 1 storage container, air conditioning equipment and electrical fitting. 1 20-foot container containing ICT equipment, cables, etc. 1 storage room with pumps, tanks, and fittings. 1 storage room with flooring materials. 40-foot containers with medical equipment and furniture ranging from beds, chairs, tables, sinks, and cabinets. All these were available. Many off-site locations were also identified where materials were located. You recall that there was a joint police and government minister operation was executed to recover hospital materials. The results of the findings of the operation have not been made public. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that there was enough equipment and building materials to complete the East Wing and move the patients of St. Jude into the East Wing of the existing structures. Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, has appointed a technical review committee to advise it on the various options to move the St. Jude Hospital reconstruction project forward and to the relocation of the hospital operations from the George Odlum Stadium at the soonest practicable time period. The government of the St. Lucia Labour Party cannot allow hospital patients and staff to remain in a dilapidated system. I want to apologize to the patients and staff of St. Jude and to thank them for their patience and endurance. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Bills, Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Development, and the Youth Economy.
Statement.
Oh, statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I update you today on where we St. Lucians in the war against the COVID-19 virus and to guide Parliament and the people on how this government intends to further advance our actions to protect our society. On August 13th, 2021,
6 days after taking office as Minister for Health, Wellness, and Elderly Affairs, I announced the presence of the Delta variant of the COVID-19 virus here in St. Lucia. This announcement was made after results from samples which were sent weeks earlier to the Caribbean Public Health Agency for processing showed 3 positive cases of the Delta variant here in St. Lucia. It is well known by now that the Delta variant of the COVID-19 virus is far more transmissible and deadlier than the other earlier variants. The Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARPHA, monitors the COVID-19 situation in most Caribbean countries, and in a presentation to the heads of government on Monday, September 13th, yesterday, Dr. Joy St. John, the Executive Director of CARPHA, showed that almost every country saw a significant increase in diagnosed cases since around the end of July into the first week of August. Every Caribbean leader who spoke at that meeting yesterday described the challenges and the need to strengthen the regional response in all departments to what is obviously an environment to the earlier COVID-19 situation in the region. The current situation. We have 2,567 active cases in St. Lucia. Over the last 30 days, an average of 396 tests have been conducted at the Ezra Long Lab. According to our figures, the daily infection rate for the past 7 days, meaning from 6th of September to the 12th of September, was 43,000 of the population per day, which is a 12% decrease over the previous week. So while we have seen a 12% decrease, this is no reason to relax and no reason to be. The age group mostly diagnosed continues to be the 25 to 49 age group, 52%, and the 50-plus age group, 23%. You may wish to note, Mr. Speaker, that females continue to account for most of the cases, with 58%, 2,565 being diagnosed. Speaker, the deaths are heart-wrenching and painful to the families and of all those who have passed. 130 souls have been lost due to COVID-19 and COVID-19 related causes. 2 of the people who died were fully vaccinated. They are now known to have had serious previous health complications. These losses, some of whom were our dear friends and families. I know many members of Parliament who have lost their relatives or dear friends over the last few months. I offer condolences on behalf of the Parliament to the families. St. Lucians from all stations in our society must be made to realize that if we have not done so already, that we are dealing with a new form of the virus, with a much faster transmission rate, which is deadlier, which is killing younger people, and which requires more disciplined behavior, not only by some people, but by all. What have we done? 1, we have worked with the Victoria Hospital to improve systems which have improved the conditions for better patient care. The medical gas system has received critical attention. Have increased personnel, communications have improved with portable and fixed physical improvements. 2, the monitoring of COVID-19 positive patients and people awaiting results needed to be improved, and we have added personnel and medical professionals. We intend to add even more. 3, the system of monitoring from testing to results, to home monitoring of positive cases, to the transfer to the Victoria Hospital if necessary, need to be streamlined, and our professionals are meeting today, this afternoon, to strengthen and tighten that system. 4, community testing and vaccinations will receive a boost with the purchase of 2 vehicles, thanks to the Minister for Finance and Prime Minister. For this purpose, with staffing, the vehicle will complement another vehicle which is being repaired for the purpose of having a permanent mobile unit for the vaccination and testing around the communities in St. Lucia. We are trying, Mr. Speaker, to limit the movement of suspected cases, that is, from traveling from their homes through our sometimes they do not get the tests and have to return on the very bus back to their homes. We are trying our best to take the tests, typically even to the homes of suspected cases. 5, assistance to St. Jude Hospital in particular, so that patients may be stabilized before transfer to Victoria Hospital. We are having some serious problems when patients present at St. Jude Hospital, and then the hospital now has, the hospital staff have to stabilize these patients before transfer to Victoria Hospital. As we know, we found a situation where St. Jude Hospital is really deficient, and we are currently taking actions to assist them. 6, on the law enforcement side, we have explained before in the last sitting, we have explained the new ticketable offenses for COVID-19 breaches. 7, the quarantine. We continue to negotiate with property owners for space in the event of even more cases. I wish to bring to the attention, Mr. Speaker of the Parliament, our efforts jointly with the Ministry of Health, Wellness and Elderly Affairs, and also the Ministry of External Affairs, in ensuring over the weekend that we caused a shipment of liquefied oxygen to reach St. Lucia from Martinique urgently, just as a backup in the event that our gas, medical gas at Victoria Hospital got into problems. We had a situation where we had to seek the assistance of the OKEU Hospital and also the Tapio Hospital. I want to take this opportunity to thank the management of the OKEU Hospital and also the Tapio Hospital for working with us. But we got a shipment from Martinique on Saturday, and I wish to thank Dr. Eugene and Miss Nancy Francis for ensuring that things went well at the ports. Vaccination imperative. Mr. Speaker, the evidence of vaccine effectiveness so far can be seen all over the world. We see daily vaccine mandates either by sector or nationally, some which have been implemented in the Caribbean. Our government has taken the position of persuasion through education and the sharing of evidence of the vaccine's effectiveness. As the science develops on the COVID-19, we share with the public what goes through our health professionals. We will therefore intensify our efforts toward vaccine uptake. We will increase our vaccination sites. We will increase activities which will encourage parents to get their families vaccinated. As we approach the possible face-to-face environment in our schools, it is imperative for us to increase vaccination among our school population eligible for the vaccine. We have enough vaccines in stock. We will encourage the approval of social activities for fully vaccinated individuals as long as the consultations and proper accounting systems are put in place. In fact, the Prime Minister has advised the public servants concerned to begin the process of consultation so that we may begin as soon as practicable. Which means, Mr. Speaker, that our government is moving step by step toward a situation where fully vaccinated individuals will be allowed to have social activities as long as we have the proper monitoring systems in place. We are going to give incentives to fully vaccinated individuals soon. Speaker, at least for now, the science has demonstrated that the most effective to save lives is to have your population vaccinated. While our government has proposed this voluntary vaccination, which I have indicated, we have a responsibility to protect the wider society. This means creating for those who take actions to join us in the protection of our society. I repeat, while our government has proposed voluntary vaccination, we have a responsibility to protect the wider society. This means creating incentives for those who are willing to take actions to join us in the protection of all of us. Thanks to the medical and non-medical workers who put their lives on every day. There are many. But today, Mr. Speaker, I want to shine a big light on the men and women of the St. Lucia Fire Service, Mr. Speaker. Like the police and other medical workers, they can be found at every odd hour of the night in protective suits. You can't make them out. They are tired. Some of them have not seen their families in days. They are working double and triple shifts, and many of them have been affected by the virus. I salute them today. They joined the soldiers at the hospital, and especially at the Victoria Hospital, where most of our COVID-19 positive patients go. Thanks to all of you, doctors, nurses, police, fire service, EMT, all of you who are on the front lines, and some of you are risking your lives daily. I pledge my personal commitment, that of the Prime Minister, and the commitment of the government, the commitment of the public servants, and I pledge our commitment to do all that we can, all that we must, to save lives and to save our country. Mr. Speaker, there are many who see the rise in COVID-19 cases as an opportunity to gloat and as an opportunity to rejoice. I say to you, Mr. Speaker, we will arm the soldiers on the front lines of this battle in the best way possible. We are preparing for the worst, but we are working so that the best occurs. There are a number of things in train which I will report on very soon. For example, procuring materials for a field hospital just in case we require it, and many other actions. But I want to take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to thank those who are making the sacrifice, and some of them really serious sacrifices, to help us win this war. I wish to thank the public. And many times, Mr. Speaker, we give the public a lot of blows for not following the protocols. I see many people and families who are following the protocols, who are wearing their masks. And I want to congratulate them and thank them for protecting us. And I want to tell those who are not doing so to join this battle, because as we are seeing now and witnessing now, it is beginning to get very close to home for many of us, that this Delta virus is a totally new game, totally new situation, and we have to get ready to defend our country in the best possible. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Swazelle Saltibus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While it's not on the order paper, Mr. Speaker, but I beg to ask a question of the minister, and it's not intended to be disruptive at all. He does not have to answer today. It's not intended to be disruptive at all. It's just a question being posed, and I'm sure he's been getting it. People have been asking, those people who have had the COVID, they're asking whether there's any sort of
Mr. Speaker, a point of order. Can I? I'm not sure why he was asking leave for him to ask his question, and you granted it or not. The questions to statements by ministers is not part of the procedure of this Honourable House. So
all I did was to identify the member from...
That's what I thought. I noted he proceeded to ask his question, and you had not yet ruled on whether he could. So...
Noted. But that question can be placed via a written statement to the minister to be responded to at the next sitting. Bills, Prime Minister and Minister for Finance, Economic Development and the Youth Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to present the second reading of a bill shortly entitled Drug Prevention and Misuse Amendment. Mr. Speaker, in the St. Lucia Labour Party's 2021 manifesto, on page 16...
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order,
the point of order is?
Mr. Speaker, my order paper does not speak to the Minister of Finance presenting a bill. It speaks to the Minister of Health.
And the point of order is?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's misleading.
Do you see,
Mr. Speaker, that
do you anything in the standing orders which prevents the reading of the first reading by a minister and the presentation of the second reading by another minister? So what's the point of order?
But I was misguided. I was misguided.
Proceed, Prime Minister.
He's practicing. Absence of his leader. Mr. Speaker, in the St. Lucia Labour Party, in its manifesto for the 2021 general elections, entitled Putting You First, You the People, on page 16 stated the following. In dialogue and consultation with health officials, education officials, and advocates for marijuana legalization, we shall develop a medicinal and recreational cannabis industry. We shall undertake to do the following. 1. Provide the necessary resources to create and maintain a sustainable and vibrant market cannabis regionally and internationally. And 2. Expunge the records of crimes related to the possession of small quantities of cannabis. And 3. Decriminalize the use of marijuana to be followed by its eventual legislation. I'm pleased to report, Mr. Speaker, that we have achieved number 2 in this Honourable House by expunging the records of crimes relating to the possession of small quantities of cannabis. And in keeping with our pledge, Mr. Speaker, the same way we pledged that we would remove facility fees, and we've done so. We are embarking on number 3, which is to decriminalize the use of marijuana. And that is being done by the amendment to the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Act, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the business of drugs and marijuana and cannabis has been fought for many years. And the jury is still out whether we have succeeded in the war on cannabis, Mr. Speaker. That war has been waged for many years, and the people who have suffered the most are the members of the real Rastafari brethren who have been harassed, molested. Some of them have been discriminated against because disrespected because of their belief in the use of marijuana as the holy herb. But, Mr. Speaker, this government believes in human rights, and this government believes in respecting the rights of all individuals. So, Mr. Speaker, this amendment today is part of a phase process, a process that will happen in phases, Mr. Speaker. We know that there was a start with the Cannabis Commission report, which, unlike how the former government treated us, we were involved in the discussions on the report, and we agreed to a large extent with what is possible, with what is in that report, Mr. Speaker. We've always said when we're in opposition that we would work with the government on matters that were beneficial to the people of St. Lucia. And when in government, we always involved the opposition in matters that were significant. Example, in the citizenship by investment policy, the then Prime Minister involved the opposition deeply in the process, Mr. Speaker. We will not treat them how they treated us by denying our constituents the basic necessities for their life. We will not do them what they did us, Mr. Speaker. That is why in our school support, we offered to both the constituencies that were represented by opposition parliamentarians a far cry to what they did us, when we were in government. Mr. Speaker, and we didn't ask them to cry. We'll never ask them to cry, Mr. Speaker, never. We know they represent the people of St. Lucia. We'll never ask them to cry. Mr. Speaker, this morning, we intend through a phased process to decriminalize up to 40 grams of cannabis, initially for one's personal use, with more comprehensive legislation and regulations for the entire cannabis industry to come later. Let me make it clear, Mr. Speaker. This is not a signal for people to start consuming cannabis irresponsibly, especially in public spaces. To get respect, one must give respect. And I mean, one must respect other people's right to breathe clean, smoke-free air. There are people with conditions such as asthma, allergies, and COPD, and other respiratory symptoms that may negatively be affected if you smoke in public, Mr. Speaker. By improving the regulatory framework in the Misuse of Drugs Act, people are able to smoke 30 grams of marijuana without being arrested or charged by the police. By improving the regulatory framework in the Misuse of Drugs Act, we will now be able to address the public health issues associated with cannabis consumption, underage use, and the predisposition to psychosis, with cannabis being a trigger and overdosing. We will now be able to roll out our national education program, which will include prevention and harm reduction strategies. We can educate our people on the rules and regulations, as well as implementing both the necessary social and physical infrastructure to deal with this regime. The new legislation is the start, which allows us to develop a cannabis industry that reports show could provide jobs when fully developed and can contribute dollars to the government's coffers. And to the Rastafarian brothers, the government extends its sincere apologies to your community for the immense suffering that you have endured over the decades under this law. The Rastafarian brothers and sisters. Mr. Speaker, the Drugs Prevention Amendment Bill, under the Act, cannabis is deemed a controlled drug by virtue of Schedule 2. As such, Pursuant to the Act, a person is found to be in possession if the person has quantities of more than 15 grams of cannabis or cannabis resin. Further, according to the Act, the prosecution and punishment such possession attracts a summary conviction of a maximum term of imprisonment of 3 years or fine not exceeding $100,000. In addition, under this Act, if a person is found with a quantity of more than 15 grams of cannabis in his or her possession, that person is in possession of a controlled drug for the purpose of supplying it to another, and this is a contravention of the Act. This is a separate offense from simple possession, and as such carries a separate penalty, which attracts a maximum penalty of between 3 to 14 years imprisonment. Therefore, a person charged with possession of a quantity of cannabis exceeding 50 grams may and could have been charged with possession for the purposes of supplying it to another. This amendment, Mr. Speaker, amends the Act to decriminalize small quantities of cannabis by allowing the possession of up to 30 grams. However, there are restrictions as it relates to the possession of cannabis. Firstly, a person is prohibited from smoking cannabis in public places, such as bars and restaurants, and is liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding $1,500. Another amendment to the Act is that a person under the age of 18, that is a child or young person who is found with cannabis, will be required to participate in a drug counseling program that is approved by the minister. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is the first stage in more comprehensive legislation to deal with the cannabis industry. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing today is we are relieving the law enforcement from the burden of having to arrest and take to court people found in possession of less than 30 grams of marijuana. This, Mr. Speaker, and remember, we already expunged from the records, we will expunge from the records anybody who was imprisoned or convicted for that. Mr. Speaker, that will relieve resources to law enforcement to deal with more serious crimes, Mr. Speaker, including crimes of corruption and white-collar crime. Mr. Speaker, I will now refer to certain sections of the bill for the consideration of honorable members, Mr. Speaker. And note, Mr. Speaker, as I said before, this is just the first stage in more comprehensive cannabis legislation that will eventually lead to cannabis being used, if found feasible, and under the Cannabis Commission report, it was found to be feasible, cannabis for export and medicinal use, and which would help in foreign exchange and employment, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer you to the Section 8, Mr. Speaker, of the Act. Section 8, restriction of possession of controlled drugs. And that is amended, Mr. Speaker, in Clause 3 of the bill to change the quantity of cannabis or cannabis resin that is considered to be possession from 15 grams to 30 grams. So that means if you found with 30 grams of marijuana, you will not be arrested by the police. Clause 4, Mr. Speaker, of the bill inserts a new section, Section 8A to the Act, to provide for an exemption from criminal liability for possession of less than 30 grams. You will not be criminally liable if you have less than 30 grams. In Clause 5, Mr. Speaker, of the bill, a new section, 14A, is added to the Act to make provision for treatment and programs for a child or young person, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that that young person who is below the age of 18 gets adequately treated if they are found with 30 grams of marijuana, Mr. Speaker, of cannabis. Mr. Speaker, a new section, Section 27A, is added to the Act, Mr. Speaker. And I want to refer honorable members to 27AB. A2, Mr. Speaker. It says that it's prohibited for the use or open to the public for any similar space access to the public in a bar or restaurant or club, an establishment except for such area forming part of the establishment as may be specifically designated by management of the establishment as an area where smoking is permitted, Mr. Speaker. So that means that you can smoke in a specified designated smoking area in a restaurant or bar, but it must be specified as a smoking area, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it also says, Mr. Speaker, that if you are at your home, in your private residence, you can smoke a joint without being arrested by the police, but only in the confines of your private residence, Mr. Speaker. At your home, in your yard, at your home, not in public, Mr. Speaker. We still are not allowing the smoking of marijuana in public places. This is a private thing that you do in a bar, once the bar has a smoking area, or in your yard, in your premises, under your roof, you can smoke a joint. That is very important, Mr. Speaker, because you know how the agents of misinformation will begin to peddle their misinformation. This is just the first stage in comprehensive legislation for the use of cannabis and for the cannabis industry as a whole, Mr. Speaker. And there is also a Cannabis Commission report, which involved the government, the then government, and the opposition in a cannabis report, Mr. Speaker. And you must also note that many countries in the CARICOM have gone this way. St. Lucia is not new. In fact, there are countries in Europe and countries in the United States that have even extended it further. So St. Lucia is not new. All we are doing is we are respecting the rights of people, particularly the rights of Rastafarian brethren. I know there are questions about using marijuana for the religious services of the Rastafari. But again, when the legislation, comprehensive legislation, is agreed to by its Honorable House, then there'll be a specific policy as it relates to the use of the herb by the Rastafarian brethren. But for now, they can smoke the herb in the private. I see the former police officers laughing. So right now, Mr. Speaker, they can smoke the herb in the confines of the home. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I end, there are hypocrites in the society that will pretend as if that doesn't exist now, Mr. Speaker. It exists now. It exists already. All we are doing is you are removing the pressure on the police and allowing them, and they'll be called very soon, Mr. Speaker, to address more serious crime, including corruption. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask honorable members to assent to agree to this bill. I think it's progressive legislation. I think it's legislation that is keeping with the times, Mr. Speaker. And the same way, the alcohol is sold everywhere. In shops, in containers, in coolers, Mr. Speaker, and everybody is not a drunkard. Everybody doesn't drink. I do not think that this bill will make everybody smoke. It doesn't make logical sense, Mr. Speaker. All it says is if you are over 18 and you choose to smoke, you will not smoke in public places. You will not influence younger people below the age of 18 to smoke, and you will smoke in the privacy of your home, and you should not be in possession of more than 30 grams of cannabis, Mr. Speaker. And as I said, this is the start of more comprehensive legislation. We know that there are loopholes that may come up, but that is the start of more comprehensive legislation for the cannabis industry generally. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Member. Before I stand, I just wish to advise members of the House that we had promised to have the loudspeaker in the Constitution Park area operational. I wish to advise that that is so. Honourable members, the question is that the Drugs Prevention and Misuse Amendment Bill be read a second time. The member for Grosley.
Can I get the podium, please? Can I get a podium?
Is it absolutely necessary, member?
For me?
Yeah.
My eyes, yes.
Arrangements are being made to have a small lectern at each speaker's section, so that is soon coming.
You put in parliamentarians first.
Mr. Speaker, please allow me to wish all our students, along with their parents, all the best as they commence a new school year yesterday. We are aware that this is perhaps the most difficult time in our nation's history, and so we expect that indeed our children will continue to be faced with a number of challenges. We on our side have made every effort to equip our children with what they need for school and to equip our children with what they can continue to expect from their parliamentary reps. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to congratulate the team that was selected to represent Fair Helen at the upcoming Under-12 Regional Tennis Championship in Santo Domingo. On the girls' team, I would like the entire Parliament, by way of a round of applause, to congratulate Amia Jamari, a student of the Grosley Primary School, Jalen Henry, a student of the Carmen Rennie Memorial School, and Brianna Jabatis, a student of the St. Joseph's Convent, on representing our St. Lucia tennis team. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to ask this Parliament to congratulate, by way of applause, boys who made this team. This includes Alil Cyril, who's a student of the Camille Henry Memorial School, Dini Estava, a student of the Grosley Primary School, and Peter Murray, a student of the Eucharist Lewis SDA Primary School. Mr. Speaker, we wish these young players all the best as they carry our nation's flag high in this tournament. Mr. Speaker, let's also join in celebrating those who were selected to represent St. Lucia on the national under-20 female football team. I know this is not customary, but in this difficult time of COVID-19, I think it's important for the Parliament to show our appreciation to these young ladies and young men who continue to try their best to put St. Lucia on the map. Mr. Speaker, please permit me leave to also share my condolences with the family of another bus driver on the Castries-Grosley Highway who met his untimely demise due to the suspected complications related to COVID-19. My thoughts and prayers go out to the family and friends of Mr. Matthew Girard. Mr. Speaker, today I stand here proud to be part of an organization that continues to prove that they are the most inclusive organization in this great nation. Mr. Speaker, it is because after winning the election of July 26, this St. Lucia Labour Party government have included one independent candidate from Central Castries, a Blue Wave candidate from Castries North, and Mr. Speaker, if you spend time with this Philip J. Pierre-led government, you would have seen that our PM had briefly joined the Green Party. Mr. Speaker, there were times at our meetings I had to rub my eyes to ensure that the person chairing the meeting was still Philip J. Pierre and not Aaron Alexander or Andre de Keris. This is because the St. Lucia Labour Party has in it a leader that can take himself out of the equation and take all aspects of our society into consideration. And now, Mr. Speaker, our nation's Green Party can say they have great support and representation in this honorable House. Now, Mr. Speaker, you will hear from members or certain members or a member that they did this and perhaps they did that as it pertains to the decriminalization of marijuana. But, Mr. Speaker, it took a man who represents the area of Masha to bring this bill to this honorable House after 42 years of independence. Mr. Speaker, this Drug Prevention and Misuse Amendment Act presents a historic moment in our nation's history. After this government walked into this honorable House a few weeks ago to expunge the records, the criminal records of persons currently incarcerated for small quantities of marijuana, this government has now taken the additional step in Clause 4 of this bill of providing an exemption for criminal liability to anyone who is in possession of less than 30 grams of marijuana. Mr. Speaker, those who know me know that I have never smoked in my life, and they would also know that I don't drink. But when I think about the two products, I marvel at the fact that alcohol, which requires so much alteration in its overall development, including fermentation, a product which scientifically has proven to have deleterious effects on the brain and, of course, the liver. This product is not considered a drug, while marijuana, which grows naturally out of the ground with no alteration in its actual production, is considered a drug. This is not to say that marijuana does not have effects on young people or people in general, but to continue to justify alcohol as a product being totally legal and marijuana as a plant being totally illegal and not even decriminalized left me scratching my head. So, Mr. Speaker, I thought alcohol was deemed illegal at a point in history. The 18th Amendment of 1919 declared the production, the transportation, the sale of intoxicating liquors illegal, though it did not outlaw the actual consumption of alcohol. As a result of this, if you remember, a black market was created which did not allow for proper regularization. There was no information given to persons as to what they were consuming. There was posh information. It was sold undercover in an ad hoc manner on the black market. As such, Mr. Speaker, during a period, interestingly, more persons were dying to consuming what was sold illegally to them from this alcohol black market. As a result of this, Mr. Speaker, the 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933, and now we see alcohol being sold everywhere. Since alcohol was considered fully legal, more research was pumped into it. More education was promoted. More information was given on all levels of potency, the proper and warnings were promoted. And now I can say, from my vantage point, despite the fact that alcohol is legal, I've still decided to stay away from it. And so, Mr. Speaker, I came to a point where I had to decide where I stood on this present debate. And I remember speaking to a man once, and he had a cup of Campari in his hand. And he could barely coherently speak. But he joined the conversation on the decriminalization of marijuana. And he was clearly inebriated. He could not stand properly. And I remember him saying desperately that there should never be decriminalization of marijuana. I told him quite candidly, if marijuana cannot be decriminalized, then alcohol shouldn't be. And so, Mr. Speaker, let's take a look at some of the statistics. According to the National Center for Health in the US, in the year 2020, which was last year, 95,000 deaths recorded in the world as a result of alcohol consumption. 95,000 deaths. In that same year, 480,000 deaths on this planet were caused by tobacco. Mr. Speaker, I'll say it again. In the year 2020, 95,000 deaths were recorded in the world as a result of alcohol consumption, and in that same year, 480,000 deaths caused by tobacco. This is while 15,852 were caused by drugs, according to the National Center of Health. 15,852. In that same article, the study and the definition of what was used for drugs included crack, cocaine, methamphetamine, opiates, painkillers, marijuana, and it even accounted for mistakes made in prescription drugs. Combined 15,852. Mr. Speaker, alcohol and tobacco, which are fully legal, saw more than 500,000 deaths last year, while all other drugs put together barely touched 15,000. Now, Mr. Speaker, for me, one death is too many, which is why I stay away altogether. But to have one in alcohol, or two in tobacco, totally legal, while speaking out strongly against the other, marijuana, it reeks of hypocrisy to me. Mr. Speaker, from where I stand, the previous policies served only to stigmatize and marginalize marijuana users, thereby undermining the efforts of many such individuals to remain or become productive and gainfully employed members of society. Mr. Speaker, in this tough time, we spend $25,260.90 on every inmate at the bodily facility yearly. $25,260.90 per inmate. And the breakdown goes: bedding, 11 cents, feeding, $25 per day, medicals, $5 per day, labor, $29.95 per day, transportation $3, clothing 43 cents per day, laundry 82 cents, water 24 cents, electricity $4, miscellaneous totaling $69.06 per day, multiplied by 365 yearly, $25,206.90 per inmate at Bordelais per year. So, Mr. Speaker, as is evident from this Prime Minister's removal, of the payment of facilities fees on the backs of parents, the sheer excitement and appreciation that was shown from this kind gesture, I have to ask myself, in this hard guava season, how much more would I have been able to do for the less fortunate with sin of just one inmate not being incarcerated for being in possession of 40 grams of marijuana or less? How much more? If anyone in this honorable house have $25,000 right now to give it to me for someone in the constituency of Grove. Spending it on anybody or incarcerate anybody for 5 bag, give it to me. I will account for it for sure. I will be able to buy close to 150 devices for kids to do their schoolwork. Mr. Speaker, I would be able to buy $160 worth of groceries for over 150 persons in the community of Rosalie. Give me a $25,000. Don't arrest anybody for a 5 bag. And Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me not to speak to young athletes listening to this debate right now. I want them to know, though this bill may pass in this lower house today, marijuana is still considered illegal by the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA. Despite being decriminalized in many countries and states, WADA ended the ban on cannabis in a paper published in the Journal of Sports Medicine. Citing a study on marijuana's ability to reduce anxiety, WADA found cannabis could help athletes better perform under pressure, alleviate stress experienced before and during competitions. So to our athletes, according to the governing board that is charged with the responsibility of mitigating fairness, marijuana in any quantity is still banned. So for those of you who followed the recently completed Olympic Games, one of the fastest women in the world, Sha'Carri Richardson, was banned from this Olympics after they found trace amounts of marijuana in her system. So I certainly not want this for any of our hard-working athletes. And so finally, Mr. Speaker, when we are able to achieve the physical space to do so, I will advise the PS of Youth and Sports to partner with the Minister for Broadcasting on an education drive on all things marijuana. I believe education is the key, and I look forward to ensuring that our young people know the facts as it pertains to the herb. And as such, I endorse the changes being made to this cannabis bill right now. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Castries South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to extend, on behalf of the government and people of St. Lucia, condolences to the family of Patrick Clayton Jules, who played with the folk band Mamai Lakai, who passed away on the weekend. He is well noted for his cultural activism, especially through music. And only last Friday, we were together at Pigeon Point when we had a live link-up with the Taiwanese embassy, broadcasting the culture and heritage of St. Lucia to the people of Taiwan. And he's in fine form playing. And of course, as fate has it, he has gone to a better place to meet his maker. And we certainly want to extend condolences to his family. Mr. Speaker, today is a great day in many respects. The decision that we are going to make here today will certainly change the nature of state-societal relations in a very fundamental way. It is also a day by which we'll be remembered for taking action that for many is a historical issue to remedy what has been seen as an action which was unjust, an action which was rooted in a colonial capitalistic practice of suppressing marijuana. And we have decided, Mr. Speaker, very early in the life of our government to ensure that the historical errors, the historical prejudices that have existed can be addressed. And it's a very significant day. It's a little unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, that because of COVID restrictions, we could not have invited brethren from the Rastafarian community to be here today. And as the Prime Minister stated, no other community has been affected more by the decisions or the decision of making the cultivation, distribution of marijuana an illegal and criminal act. But we'll come to this a little later on, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister indicated that we are proceeding in a phased approach. We're taking it in a number of stages. At our last sitting, we took the necessary legislative action to expunge from the record the criminal account of persons who had been involved in minor acts, including the possession of. And some asked, why were you all doing this? We had to do it because we felt that there were too many young men who, for the sake of possession of a joint, now have a criminal record. And Mr. Speaker, since the passage of this act, we already have one application from a young man who wants that record expunged, Mr. Speaker. One application so far. And you know, I'm not involved in the legal processes and the judicial processes. It's quite ironic because I'm reading, he attached to it his police certificate, his certificate of character. And it actually says, Mr. Speaker, that he was charged in January 1999, and the offense was possession of controlled drugs. His sentence was community service, and under status, it has spent. And of course, it's asterisk, and there's an explanation that when, according to the Criminal Records Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, spent means it is now considered that you never committed it, you were never charged, you were never prosecuted, whatnot. But it is still written on your certificate of character. So this young man who is going to go and apply for a visa or a job and is asked to bring a certificate of character brings a document that says it is spent But it still records it. It still records it. So the employer looks at this and says, okay, it is spent, meaning that officially you never committed it, you were never charged, but it is still there. And when in the document that he has filled out, he was in possession of 1 joint from 1999, 1 joint. And he has on his record his certificate of character that he was found guilty of possession of a controlled drug. This is what we corrected at the last sitting. This is what we corrected at the last sitting. And today, we're taking it 1 step further. It's not a complete process, but you are taking it 1 step further. We are now saying that if you are in possession of no more than 30 grams, which is not much more than something like this, Mr. Speaker, you will not and cannot be convicted for such possession. We now need to go on to the 3rd stage, where we will address issues of cultivation and distribution and those other issues relating to the establishment of an industry around the use of cannabis. And it is a lot more complex. What we have done so far is probably a little more straightforward, fundamental, but a little more straightforward. The construction of an economy around cannabis requires some finesse from what that we've found. And of course, some will say we should have waited to do everything at once, that others did everything at once. You can argue that, but if you waited 5 years and you did not do it, then I'm not sure why the wait is worth. But we will complete the process, and we will go the full circle. But I am very happy of what we are doing today, Mr. Speaker. Very happy. And I want you to bear with me, Mr. Speaker. As I reflect on what we are doing, and more importantly, why are we doing this, Mr. Speaker? So let me share with you my thoughts as to why we are doing this. Mr. Speaker, many of us in this gathered chamber would have had our own personal journeys and associations with marijuana. Not all, and I heard a member from Jose said that he's never smoked and he doesn't drink. And other members in here would tell you they've never smoked and they've never desired to smoke. So everyone has their story, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you my own story in sorts of ways, Mr. Speaker. I grew up in an area where people smoked, Mr. Speaker. They do. They smoke, Mr. Speaker. And for my own self, Mr. Speaker, my own ideological orientation largely associated with the Rastafarians in the area where I grew up. You know, I can get, Mr. Speaker. We call him Nayaketi, Mr. Kadi's son. Right there by the bridge, Mr. Speaker. He was studying medicine in Jamaica. Came back down. I think he was the first non-Jamaican to be chairman of Chancellor Hall. Came down and told us so much about Rastafarianism and what it meant, and Pan-Africanism and Marcus Garvey. That's why I first heard of those noble ideals of bringing people of African descent and Africans together in that common search to liberate black people, Mr. Speaker. That's where we learned it. And there were many others like him, Mr. Speaker. I heard they called my eldest brother George Jackson, Soledad brother. I didn't know what that was. I went to an encyclopedia, read up on it, and I got to know the importance of persons like George Jackson for the struggle, civil rights movement in America. There were so many Rastafarians, the music they played, the education we got from them. And some of us, not all of us, but I know where my ideological groundings came from. You know, my neighbor who played culture music, Bob Marley music, and I went into his house and he had the Che Guevara posters, and then all those, you know, Malcolm X, Mr. Speaker. That's where we got it from. Were they bad people? They were not. When I got involved in the youth movement, persons like Earl Bousquet, Lawrence Poyot, Henry Charles, who I knew many years ago, the first person to nominate me for a youth position was the legend Jati. Legend Jati Rastafari. And I lost that election in 1985. And he said to me, first, never lost that. And he said to me, youth, you have a lot of potential. Although he criticizes me on Facebook these days because I'm part of Babylon. But, Mr. Speaker, he was it, and he was Rastafari, and he was a legend. He was a lyricist of the highest order, writing the best calypsos in St. Lucia, and he was Rastafari. But we had a historical notion in those days, Rastafari were bad people. And they were bad because they supposedly smoked marijuana, and marijuana was a bad thing to have. We were conditioned to think so. We were conditioned to think so. And I'm not suggesting there are not bad aspects to marijuana, because the member from Growley has already made a reference to it. But so many of us, our ideological consciousness came from an interaction with the Rastafarian community. And they were oppressed. I cannot forget the days when the police would come wrong in those days. It was called the cage. The cage. And make all of us lie down on the ground and search us. Fresh M16s after the Grenada Revolution was the order of the day. Because they thought we had marijuana and they were searching us. And I don't blame the police. They were part of a system and institution that was so designed to perform those functions. And when the Prime Minister offered the apology this morning, I'm in that. Because there have been so many people in our history that have been persecuted and prosecuted, Mr. Speaker, because of marijuana. And we are correcting this today. We are correcting it, Mr. Speaker. So many of us in our own personal journeys have had encounters with marijuana, encounters with the Rastafarians, who have in many ways shaped the ideological consciousness, the social consciousness of so many people. And today, we are bringing an end to that history, Mr. Speaker. From today, history has been rewritten. It will not be written of persons like this young man who had one joint. And for the last 22 years, he has on his record that he was in possession of controlled drugs. It was the law then, Mr. Speaker. But it will no longer be the law, Mr. Speaker. But why has it changed, Mr. Speaker? Why has it changed? Mr. Speaker, I wrote my PhD on how changes in the international system has changed relationship between state and society. And it is a fact in history that things that were seen in one particular way, in one particular historical period, will change over time. There was a time, as a member from Grosley said, when alcohol was prohibited. That no longer exists. There was a time when slavery was justified by church and state. That no longer. We've now accepted that it's totally unacceptable to have slaves. There was a time when you could not vote unless you were male and had property. It's changed over time. Because as civilization evolves, as society evolves, there are changes to the norms that govern our behavior. And the laws follow from that. There was a time when trade unions were illegal. There was a time when they didn't have political parties. All those things throughout history have had to change. And we are finding ourselves now in history, and reflect on this. The country that was most vigorous in suppressing marijuana is now the one legalizing it, the United States. As a youth leader, Mr. Speaker, I recall going on a Partners of the Americas trip. Nancy Reagan had just declared, just say no. You know, this global campaign to stop young people from using drugs. Essentially, they meant marijuana, in our case. And I sat and listened to all the presentations, and they asked, how many people in this room have ever smoked before? And you're watching everybody see nobody putting up their hands, whatnot, because you're kind of gathering. But now in the United States, at the state level, You have the most legalization of marijuana. The most legalization. The same people who were telling us and funding our police officers destroy all evidences and presence of marijuana. To say in that same country, United States, it is legalized and commercialized. And what are we to do? What are we to do? Again, the changing norms of the times. And in some ways, and let me strong notice, the same way that person's sexuality should not be the cause for any disadvantage or prejudice, someday we will have to answer this question. I'll probably not be in this chamber, but future parliamentarians will have to deal with that issue as well. Think about it. And I remember the member from Viewfort South many years ago, in an encounter with him, somebody asked him about the future laws relating to a person's sexuality, whatnot. He cautioned them many years ago. And he said to them, the time will soon come when all those laws will have to be struck off our books because they are unconstitutional. And he's right. We're already seeing the movement towards dealing with those laws pertaining to people's sexuality. And we'll have to face the reality of what it is. Today, we are dealing with this issue of marijuana. And history has forced us to change this law because it is no longer justifiable in our civilization. We know at the national level, Mr. Speaker, and think about it, so many young men have been arrested for having a joint. Search on the blocks. Tell me one person from upper class that have ever gone to Bordelais or ever been charged for being in possession of a joint. I don't know. Maybe they have been. I cannot tell you one. And I know a lot of them that smoke marijuana. I know a lot of them, middle class, upper class, that smoke weed. They smoke more weed than the fellas on the blocks. I ain't calling names. They smoke more weed than fellas on the blocks. Have you ever heard them being arrested? Have you ever heard them going to court for possession of one joint? Never. That's the reality. So this thing is also a socio-cultural action on our part to deal with those realities. And the Prime Minister spoke about people in this society. I won't use his descriptive term. But they know that they smoke. They know that. But you still hear them saying they should not legalize, they should not decriminalize marijuana. But they know their children smoke. In fact, I had an encounter years ago when I was a PS, Permanent Secretary in Youth and Sports, with a particular senior public servant. And she said to me, I'd much rather my child smoke at home than going on the block to smoke. I never know what can happen to him there. So he can smoke at my... I thought she was very progressive, very liberal. But the point is she had come to the realization that she could not stop her child from smoking anymore. And she must have a safe environment for her child to smoke. And that was the match of history. That was the match. So let us be very cognizant of the fact that marijuana smoking is widespread in this country. I was involved in the youth movement in the 80s when you did not speak about smoking marijuana. But by the time I had become Permanent Secretary by 1999, I sat in a consultation on a new national youth policy. And students sat there, and we spoke about drugs, and the children stood up and said, but all our friends smoking, so we should just put in a youth policy, they should decriminalize marijuana. And I was really, I could not believe such a dramatic shift had taken place at that level in our society. And I got to understand that we fool in ourselves. There are so many people who do smoke. And there are a lot more who want to smoke. This law, this change, reflects what has happened in our society and is happening in our society. Anybody who pretends that it is this amendment that will encourage people to start smoking is telling a tale. It's all over. It is all around us. But a lot of persons are hiding to do it, because there's still a little social stigma attached if you're smoking weed. This will deal with this. No need to be in the closet. The law allows you to have a certain amount that you can smoke. Nobody's encouraging you to do it. Just like no one encourages you to drink alcohol, no one encourages you to pick the vices. This one is a reflection of what happens in our society. So what are we doing, Mr. Speaker? And the Prime Minister went through the various sections of the amendment, Mr. Speaker. We are saying, Mr. Speaker, that if you are in possession, Mr. Speaker, of less than 30 grams, then you will not be criminally convicted, Mr. Speaker. And for us, this is sufficient for a person to claim that it is for my personal use and not for trafficking or not for distribution. Of course, the big question will always be, how do you obtain it? But we will deal with that in the next stage. We will deal with that in the next stage. But for now, you will not be criminally convicted if you have to be found with it, Mr. Speaker. In new section, it is added. And similar to what I just said, Mr. Speaker, that, and we want to reinforce the point, that you will not be found guilty of an offense if you have at least 30 grams, Mr. Speaker. And later on, Mr. Speaker, we spoke about treatment and programs for child and young persons. This is critical because in regularizing societal behavior, which is what we're doing, we're saying there still has to be an emphasis on treatment of children and young persons who are found with marijuana. That should also extend to alcohol and to cigarettes as well, Mr. Speaker. It should also extend to that because it is not only alcohol that can be detrimental, not only marijuana can be detrimental, cigarettes can be detrimental, alcohol can be detrimental, Mr. Speaker. So that clause should be consistent across all, Mr. Speaker. And the respective agencies must take note of this. Not just marijuana, alcohol, tobacco, any substance abuse, there must be treatment and rehabilitation for children and young persons. Any substance abuse. And I want to make that clear. This is not just for the sake of marijuana. That should exist across the board. Across the board, Mr. And I'm very clear, Mr. Speaker, and I think the point was made by the Prime Minister, that we need to have proper public education campaign to tell our people of the dangers of substance abuse. And I think we all know in this chamber the effects, and we all hear in our constituencies about COPD. The amount of young men and few women that are affected by COPD. And that practice must stop, Mr. Speaker. It must stop. Too many lives are lost. I don't know whether it's only Castro South, but I know we have a serious problem with COPD. And in my 5 years, going on to 6 years, I've known quite a few young men who've died from COPD. So there is an issue with substance abuse. In fact, even now in our fight against the pandemic, to manage the pandemic, there is a strong view that alcohol is one of the precipitating factors that cause people to congregate, come together, and spread the virus. We have an issue with substance abuse. Do not finger point at marijuana only. So we need to deal with this, Mr. Speaker. A new section 27A, restriction on smoking cannabis in a public place. This is critical. But the Prime Minister made the point that this is not a signal for everyone to just light up a joint, walking in town, smoking your joint or whatever, you know, do. A small one, not a big one. You know, it's not a signal for this. This does not say you have a right to light where, and have the freedom to do so irrespective of the person next to you. It doesn't say this. But I also believe, Mr. Speaker, and I believe it's probably already enacted, no smoking should be in public. Whether marijuana, cigarettes, no smoking should be in public. Very clear on this, Mr. Speaker. Because we have all learned that secondhand smoke is even worse than the smoking itself. There should be no smoking. Now, we already have a problem with smoking within. You go to a football match. I can never forget, Mr. Speaker, you were probably there. The first football match at the National Stadium, when you opened the National Stadium, the light went off. I'd never seen so many lighters light in the darkness. And by the time the lights came back on, there was a smoke hanging over them, because we tried and we said no smoking in the public facility. The moment the lights went off for a few minutes, the amount of spliffs that were lit was unbelievable. You go to in the old days, to Masha, in the Road Boy stands. The Road Boy stands. You go to so many public events, and people do smoke. We have to reinforce the point that there should be no smoking in public, whether cigarettes or marijuana. Totally. We have to enforce that. First, we have to try to do it through education. Because we need, I'm one who fully believes that before you use the tough action, you need to educate people. I'm one who believes you only build resilience in your people through education and an internalization of what is right. If you get people to act only under force, you can never be a resilient people, because you will only act when you are forced to do so under the threat of violence against your person. So we need to be very clear on this one, Mr. Speaker. But in this same clause, we are allowing for smoking to take place in designated places in bars, restaurants. Now, that's fair enough. But I think, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice and the AG has to ensure in the regulations that a person can't just say, you know, I put 3 little tables on a side and that's my smoking section and you can smoke there. It has to be more structured than that. If in your bar or your nightclub you're going to have a smoking section, it should be clearly isolated and separated from the rest of the patrons. There should be no opportunity for patrons who do not smoke to have to receive smoke from a smoking section. And I don't know how we can tighten this, whether through regulation, but I don't think the intent, Mr. Sir, is for persons to just decide a certain section is for smoking. We're ensuring that the rest of the patrons are adequately respected and protected. Because if I am not to be a smoker and do not want secondhand smoke, I do not want to go into any bar, restaurant, nightclub, any place and have to be exposed to it. So have a smoking area, designated smoking area, but make sure it is done properly. And before that can be applied, there should be clear rules as to how it can be applied. So, Mr. Speaker, in my short presentation, I think I want to place clearly, I have placed clearly on the record my support for this amendment. I believe we are correcting a historical wrong. And I believe we are reflecting the mood and the sentiment of our society. I believe what has, in my view, been a capitalist compressed marijuana, Mr. Speaker, we will see we taking another step to correct this wrong, Mr. Speaker. And I look forward to the third stage, where we debate and discuss the commercialization of marijuana and the conditions under which this will be done. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member first, Brazil. Saltibus.
Before me?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't realize you have that sort of authority. Mr. Speaker, so far the contributions made by members I support, with the exception of just one part of the member for Grosley making the statement that some would claim that they would have been instrumental in where we are today with this. And I want to make it very clear, Mr. Speaker, that from day one, and the member for Vieux North would bear with me on that, from day one, I did indicate that this should never be a political issue. Okay? This should never be anything to gain political points. Had it been, Mr. Speaker, in my tenure in government, I could have taken a shortcut and brought this bill to Parliament a lot earlier, Mr. Speaker. But from very early, I thought it necessary, Mr. Speaker, to make it very clear that this should never be something to seek political favor. Mr. Speaker, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, young man, and I grew up to the music of Peter Tosh, Bob Marley, Burning Spear, you know, Culture, where, you know, I remember Culture always used to say, lay your burdens by the riverside, and a member for Castries South always teases me about why I love the river so much. But Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons, and I not necessarily took offense, but I felt that the reading of the bill, I would have preferred the member for Vieux North. Because, Mr. Speaker, I love the old school approach that he took to it in the last reading, where he referred to a spliff as a tampi. That's a very, very, very old saying, Mr. Speaker, and it shows somebody, you know, definitely familiar, not necessarily with smoking, but with, you know, the literature and the education in those days, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I felt the Prime Minister should have given him that position, considering he was also, you know, the lead for the opposition at the time in being on the Cannabis Commission. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to make it very clear, Mr. Speaker, that this bill does not decriminalize marijuana. We have to make this very clear to the St. Lucian public. And while I will, and I have said it before, that I think this is a piecemeal approach to the whole cannabis legislation, and I heard from members that this was just a beginning. But, Mr. Speaker, there are some fundamental things I felt and I think that should have been included in that bill based on the, what would say, the groundbreaking of this making of history, Mr. Speaker. And while the Prime Minister made an apology to the Rastafarian community, I thought it would have been of a lot of value, Mr. Speaker, if mention was made particularly to the use of the herb, as the Rastafarian community calls it, sacrament, Mr. Speaker, and to provide, Mr. Speaker, special mention to the use of marijuana in the temple, Mr. Speaker. I have been, as well, member from Labrie, in the temple to when we were doing the whole Cannabis Commission, to observe what was going on. And, Mr. Speaker, I do not think the true Rastafarian community will be satisfied with just no mention made of what happens in the place of worship and the specific use of the herb as a sacrament and in terms of the quantities allowed, Mr. Speaker. And while we speak of the other stages of this bill, Mr. Speaker, the question is how soon, Mr. Speaker, and what happens to specifically the Rastafarian community on days of worship where the quantities would be more than 30 grams, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I also have a concern, and I have made mention of it in other places, Mr. Speaker, of what is termed synthetic cannabis. And, Mr. Speaker, it is very, very critical that we make mention of synthetic cannabis, Mr. Speaker. Because, Mr. Speaker, there are many, many families in St. Lucia who have been victims of the children going to various parties and social activities and deciding to experiment, Mr. Speaker, with some of the byproducts of marijuana. And because there's nothing in place to control what goes into some of these byproducts, Mr. Speaker, where they're extremely hallucinogenic properties, they have ended up at the wellness center. A lot of these things remain hush-hush under the table, Mr. Speaker, because of the people that have been affected, Mr. Speaker. But I think it is very important and relevant that even if we were going to put out a piece, we should have recognized the importance of the use of synthetic marijuana and what can be done in terms of byproducts and the effect on the vulnerable and the young people in the society. So, Mr. Speaker, while I agree that in this day and age, this is forward legislation, but I do believe some additional amendments should have been enacted in this bill. And Mr. Speaker, I want to take the opportunity to ask St. Lucians to take a read of the CARICOM Commission report that was chaired by Dr. Andrew, and also to read the Cannabis Commission report that was done here in St. Lucia to gain an insight into where we have come today. Because there is incontrovertible proof, Mr. Speaker, that there is more benefit in the use of marijuana than has been taught to us over the years. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because so much work has been done. So much work and research has been done. I feel it is an injustice at this point for us to have come with just a piecemeal bill to this House. There's a lot more that we could have included in this bill. And, Mr. Speaker, we heard mention of it, but it is critical. The member for Cashew South made light of it when he said we will hear about where people are going to get access to the 40 grams. And that is serious, Mr. Speaker, because somebody has to provide 30 grams to people who are going to be using it. And the person who's going to provide 30 grams, they're not carrying 40 grams. So, Mr. Speaker, in the work that has been done by the Cannabis Commission, which included the member for Beaufort North, we spoke about, and it has been included in terms of if somebody wishes to grow some trees by their home, the number of trees they would be allowed. If a farmer was to decide to go into the cultivation of marijuana, what size of a plot that he would be allowed to grow, where would that be sold, Mr. Speaker? What sort of arrangement? Would it be a cooperative? Would there be a government involvement, Mr. Speaker? So, Mr. Speaker, I am concerned that the piecemeal approach will create a lot more problems because it means, Mr. Speaker, that some of the people who traverse our waters to get what they call the high grade from St. Vincent will still find themselves, while trying to provide the 40 grams, which is legal now, would still find themselves in problems with the law. So these are things, Mr. Speaker, I think mention should be made and we should have included in this act, Mr. Speaker. Also very important, Mr. Speaker, 30 grams. For those of us who may not know what 30 grams is in terms of marijuana, it's a small sandwich bag filled with marijuana. I'm not sure how many smokes in that, depending on how large you roll it. But, Mr. Speaker, importantly, Mr. Speaker, is somebody smoking and under the influence and driving, Mr. Speaker, similarly to somebody drinking alcohol and causing an accident on the road, Mr. Speaker. We had to have amendments in this bill to capture driving under the influence, working machinery under the influence. These are things, Mr. Speaker, that should be captured in this. So while I am happy that this government is moving forward with the legislation, I am, Mr. Speaker, disappointed of the approach in terms of what we're coming with, Mr. Speaker, because there's a lot of work that has been done in this, where this bill could have included a lot more, Mr. Speaker. And so the concern is when and how soon will we come with the other components of the bill, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we look at the big picture. We encompass everybody. The member for would be very familiar with the role that Invest and Lucia played in terms of the investment potential of having a market in cannabis. And so he would know the potential. And all of these things, Mr. Speaker, should be captured and not, in my mind, you know, the manner in which we are approaching it. When I was the minister chairing the movement of this bill, Mr. Speaker, when young people would have met me on the road and they would have spoken about, you know, they're happy where the country is going in this day and age, Mr. Speaker, one of the things I always indicated to the young people is that the penalties for smoking in public will be harsher than when you were caught with a spliff previously. And these are some of the things that must, Mr. Speaker, be recognized, because as the member for Castries South said, not everybody likes the smoke. Secondhand smoke, Mr. Speaker, has been recognized to be extremely dangerous. And so all of these things, Mr. Speaker, must be brought forward and must be brought forward in early time, in good time, Mr. Speaker, to avoid confusion, to avoid continuous abuse, to protect our vulnerable, particularly the young people. I'm happy that, you know, the mention was made of the consultation with the young people with regards to counseling, Mr. Speaker, if a young person is found in possession. That's extremely important, but a lot more should be put in there, a lot more meat as it relates to the social programs for people found in possession, young people found in possession and young people using, Mr. Speaker, cannabis. So my main concern here, well, actually three main concerns here, Mr. Speaker, is one, I felt the Rastafarian community should be acknowledged in a big way, Mr. Speaker. It's not just saying we're sorry or apologizing, Mr. Speaker, but recognizing the use of cannabis in their worshipping. One, how do we deal with people with 40 grams and they abuse it, they use it, and they drive and they get themselves in an accident? What are the implications? What are the laws? And, Mr. Speaker, the whole issue, Mr. Speaker, of the synthetic marijuana. You know, there's a reggae artist, I think it's Sizzler, who said that once you put a chemical on the herb, once you put anything on the herb, Mr. Speaker, it becomes a chemical. And as I said before, Mr. Speaker, when the days when I grew up, when all the Peter Toshes and the Bob Marleys and the Bernie Spears used to profess about the herb, Mr. Speaker, it is nothing like what we are seeing today in this society. There are many things that are being done to raise the levels of THC, and we as a society need to be concerned about that. I believe the advancement of a cannabis bill is forward legislation, Mr. Speaker, but they need to have a lot of protection barriers for our vulnerable people. And it's not just about smoking, but we are going into this industry, Mr. Speaker, because of the investment potential as it relates to byproducts and other, you know, derivatives from the marijuana plant. So I support, but with caution, Mr. Speaker, because I felt that a lot more could have been included in this bill. Thank you very much.
Member for Babino.
What?
The member for Viewfort South, the member for Babino has yielded.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, because I was eclipsed by the member for Suzelle and now Babino is a bit much. So thank you, Mr. Speaker, for looking my way. Mr. Speaker, I want to to thank you for the opportunity to contribute briefly on this bill. I will not follow the precedent set by earlier speakers of getting into the sociological implications of decriminalizing marijuana and the like, or going back into history to trace our steps and to have a better sense of the political implications, the legislation criminalizing marijuana and its consequences. I will take a slightly different journey, Mr. Speaker. I understand and heard a member for Sozel Solibus indicating that from very early on, he emphasized that issue of decriminalizing marijuana should not be political. I believe him. I believe that his theology on this matter, that is his. But you know, statements and history can sometimes be very harsh in its judgment. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, I recall well the general elections of 2016 when the St. Lucia Labour Party was unceremoniously from political office. That, Mr. The then opposition former government was campaigning throughout the length and breadth of this country and proceeded to tell people of this country that they would be decriminalizing marijuana within months of their assumption of office. And that galvanized a lot of the young people, certainly galvanized some of the young people in my own country for South. And they really believed that this would have been done. But so often with these, when you assume office, it suddenly becomes a little more daunting, a little more complex, a little more challenging. So it was a little reversal in this campaign, Mr. Speaker, and I'm speaking before South, by the way, that I had the opportunity to say to the people in Beaufort South who had expected the former government to have enacted legislation that this time it will be for this current government to do so. And what they had been promised and had not been forthcoming will in fact be done by this government. And so today I welcome this legislation, and no matter what my comments about the legislation may be, my issues with the legislation, please, Mr. Speaker, it ought never to be interpreted that I do not support the fact that this legislation is before the Honorable House today. It has my full backing, and certainly it answers to a question that had been repeatedly asked of me throughout the campaign in my constituency in Beaufort South. Mr. Speaker, the second thing is this. I guess the Honorable Prime Minister and a member for Castries and I are the oldest parliamentarians in this House, probably followed by the member for Castries North. And so whenever we speak, we carry with us the long stretch of history. History provides all kinds of reflections. It warns, it cautions, it encourages, it advises. And you know, Mr. Speaker, on this occasion, when I look at legislation and the process leading to it, it is difficult when actions become detached from the history that has created this environment and has put us in this conjuncture that we are now reflecting on. And yes, Mr. Speaker, history can be amazingly unkind sometimes. And the tragedy of history sometimes, Mr. Speaker, is this, that we get so trapped in the prism of partisan politics, of competitive politics, that we sometimes do not give regard or praise to who really deserves it. I, for one, have said, I look for no praise, I have said repeatedly, I want nothing to be named after me. Nothing, Mr. Speaker. I want, when the time comes for me to make my departure, all I want is for the people of Vieux South to say, Kenny Anthony, he was a good and decent man. That's all I want, Mr. Speaker. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, that does not mean that we should not recognize others for their contribution. And one of the very unfortunate things that occurred in the tenure of the former government was that this very report, the CARICOM Cannabis Commission report, the author of that report, well, the principal author of that report is Professor Rosemary Antoine, that happens to be a wife of the member for Vieux South, was never ever given the opportunity to come to St. Lucia to address the cannabis community or those who advocated for decriminalization and setting up an industry, and to discuss the outcome of the report and the implications of the report. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, it goes further than that. I've always said that when you see it comes to our country, we must single it out and detach it from people and give praise to the country as a whole. I've always said so. And I'll give an example. I hear everybody talk about risk insurance in the region, and every time you have a big disaster, everybody, Mr. Speaker, that you're going to call on the risk insurance facility that exists. But you know whose idea it was to create that insurance facility, Mr. Speaker? It happened to be a former Prime Minister called Kenny Anthony, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have it today. But we don't have the courage to say that this was a contribution and recommendation of a government in St. Lucia. No. We're going to bury it, because to praise that is to praise Kenny Anthony. Stop that. Likewise, Speaker, so-called with this Cannabis Commission. The person who recommended that CARICOM establish a commission that has led to the changes in CARICOM was a former Prime Minister, Kenny Anthony, to a CARICOM meeting. And I recall what occurred when I made a proposal, precisely because we had had a meeting with the president, former president of the United States, Barack Obama. And we had raised, in fact, I had raised with him the question of how is it that the United States expected that individual states were proceeding to decriminalize marijuana and create industries in their states, and yet the United States was putting exorbitant pressure on these small islands to contain trafficking in marijuana. And he replied to say, yes, it is an anomaly. He himself was not very sure how this would be dealt with at the federal level, but he would not step forward march of states to deal with the decriminalization of marijuana and its production. Although, when Rob Gonzalez at that meeting asked him about the potential for creating an industry, he said to Rob Gonzalez, look, saying you believe that somehow creating an industry out of marijuana will be panacea to replace banana production and somehow earn you foreign exchange, you better think twice, because already in the States, the sheer scale of production of marijuana means that ultimately we're all going to be victims of competition for the production of marijuana for export and for consumption. Now, Mr. Speaker, I say those things because at that point, it dawned certainly on St. Lucia, the then delegation, that we needed a systematic approach to dealing with the decriminalization of marijuana. that we cannot approach it piecemeal, because what happens if a Jamaican arrives in St. Lucia and believes that he can have in his possession marijuana because it is not legal, because it is legal in Jamaica? What happens when he arrives in St. Lucia? And I remember raising the question with the former Prime Minister with the current Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, now under a lot of pressure in Canada, so we have to wait and see. And I said to him, you know, Mr. Prime Minister, what am I to do with your Canadians when they come to my country? Now that you have decriminalized, what do we do? They come to St. Lucia, carry with them marijuana in their possession, and they're caught with it. What do we do? And he smiled in his useful and boyish way. He says, well, you know, Prime Minister, that is simple. Apply your laws. So I said, all right. It means that you don't mind if we put in jail a couple of them now and then. You don't mind that. And you wouldn't protest, right? He laughed. Now, I say these things because I wanted to bring home the confluence of events, Mr. Speaker, that paved the way for the steps we are taking today. And it is true that I have interests. It is true I'm compromised, Mr. Speaker, but I'm aware that in this chamber and elsewhere, no one will speak for the person who played such a key role in paving policies within the CARICOM, and that is a Professor Rosemary Bell Antoine. Now, I'm going to be accused of conflict of interest. You know, I'm always accused of it. But let me say, Mr. Speaker, while I made a recommendation for a CARICOM commission to examine this whole issue of the production, consumption of marijuana in the region, I was not the one who recommended her to chair. It was the Prime Minister of St. Vincent. But of course, maybe that is insignificant, because I'll tell you, he was my good friend at the time. And so he did me a favor. But I never asked for it. She's the very same person, Mr. Speaker, who was the key author of the St. Lucia Labor Code. Again, that. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I watched the passage of time. Now our labor code is being utilized both by employers and employees. Our workers have now begin to get some form of redress. They have a better sense of what their rights are at the workplace. It was due to that work. But no one, Mr. Speaker, will stand up and give praise and thanks for the work that she did. Nobody. Too much. Too much. And that's the kind of tragedy that you have, Mr. Speaker. And of course, that same labor code, I'm hoping during this tenure of this government that we will clean it up, because there are a lot of problems. And as a practicing lawyer now, and as one that is involved in labor litigation, there's no question that there are a lot of issues with the labor code. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that an effort will be made in this tenure to deal with the issues in an exhaustive way, to really make it that all sides could respect. But what matters most is that both employers and employees have now developed a certain degree of trust for the Labor Act or Labor Code, as the case may be. I agree with the lone member for the opposition, the member for Swazell Saunders, and you know, Mr. Speaker, whenever I say him, I never say Swazell. I always add Saunders, because he knows that is my foundation. The source of my existence is in Saunders, and I have special interest in Saunders. And he can count himself lucky that in this last election that I didn't spend much time there to detail his many sins in the community of Saunders. But he knows what some of these sins are, including one of the worst roads ever constructed in Ireland, that piece of P.I. Gap to Saunders. But that's another story, and I'm sure the budget will come and we can talk about that at some other time. So I always attach the Saunders in special recognition of the unique role and responsibility that he has. Mr. Speaker, I say this basically to make the point that he drew reference to the reports, and I hope that the government would, in the next few days, take a leading role. The CARICOM Commission report is on the site, the website, but I think the local commission here, I've never seen such a report. I would love to see it. I hope it can be made public so that it can be part of the conversation regarding this broader issue, and so that we can be well informed as to what the possibilities are and what route we need to take. I am fortified by the fact that the member for Castries East, the Prime Minister, indicated that we are part of a process. Yes, I saw the legislation expugning the criminal records of those who were found guilty of cannabis possession and use and so on. I think, again, that legislation in time is going to require some adjustment, but that's neither here nor there. What really matters at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, is that those records will be expugned and at least persons will get a clean slate. This is the second step, as the Prime Minister says, that we are decriminalizing the possession of marijuana, 30 grams. And then the next step will be the question of creating, quote unquote, an industry. Because that third step, Mr. Speaker, is vital. Because legislation creates one major issue, in that if we're going to be in possession of 30 grams of cannabis, the question is, where did they get it from? Who supplied it? What is the source of it? Did it not come from the highlands of St. Lucia, in the forests of St. Lucia, on the farms in St. Lucia or elsewhere? And so the chain of illegality or unlawfulness is not really amputated until we deal fundamentally with the issue of growing marijuana at its source. And I'm hoping, Mr. Speaker, that the legislation setting in train a mechanism for the creation of an industry is done quickly, although from my experience it is extraordinarily difficult legislation to craft and to produce because of the myriad of complex issues that accompany such legislation. The only caveat at this preliminary stage for me, Mr. Speaker, any such legislation is whether that legislation protects the small farmers who are involved in marijuana production. You see, Mr. Speaker, because there are a lot of vultures out there, they're waiting, they're watching and hoping that when the day comes that there is full decriminalization, the basis is laid for the creation of industry, then they will form their companies and pounce on the industry so that they can make their millions. But the government should not be concerned with these people. It has to be concerned with the small farmers who for years bore the brunt of the oppressive behavior of the security forces of this country and who now find redemption in the passage of this legislation. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm just saying as a member for Vieux South that I am putting on notice that I will be very concerned about watching the situation with the small farmers, ensuring that they get the protection that they truly deserve. That having been said, Mr. Speaker, I have two observations about the bill before us, even if, as I indicated to you, I have no fundamental difficulty with the fact that this amendment is being made. The first is, and again, this is lack of knowledge. I really haven't had the time to check it. This issue of cannabis resin, I would have liked to have seen a definition of cannabis resin in the legislation, but I assume that the Dangerous Drugs Prevention and Misuse Act does have a definition. I assume so. But in any event, it may have been necessary to bring it up to date because of the rapid changes in the technology that has occurred. But that's neither here nor there. The second point, though, is a little more fundamental one. I think that is being touched on. Mr. Speaker, what we have done, of course, is to allow persons to have the 30 grams of marijuana in their possession and ensure that they can use it. Of course, quite rightly in the legislation, we have ensured that we are restricting the consumption in public places, and I'm also very happy too that some recognition is paid that we need to protect the school children as best as we can. That being said, much of the talk about criminalizing marijuana and so on has to do with the so-called medicinal and health benefits of decriminalization of marijuana consumption. That has been the talk for years, and I think there is now increasing evidence that there are clear medicinal benefits to be derived from the consumption of marijuana in its various forms. While I say this, I'm going to caution my point of view to another point that I will shortly make. But, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say that for years in our community, the Rastafarians and others whom the Rastafarians have persuaded have made marijuana tea available to persons with various ailments, and of course to other persons who have other example, glaucoma. It is widely believed that the marijuana derivatives can assist these persons in dealing with issues. I say all of this, Mr. Speaker, to bring home the point that we really should have taken the opportunity today, as was done in Trinidad and Tobago, to allow persons to own 3 or 4 trees of marijuana around their homes. We should have taken that opportunity to do so, Mr. Speaker, precisely because of this medicinal usages that I referred to earlier on. I don't know, Mr. Speaker, if it is too late. I really don't have the time. Maybe the Attorney General can look at it in the next few minutes. But I would certainly recommend that we take a look very quickly at the legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, which I assume some reference must have been made when this was being drafted. Not that the identical language is used, but in Trinidad and Tobago, they too made it lawful for a person to own 30 grams of cannabis or 5 grams of cannabis resin. And that's why I was a little concerned that we needed to sharpen up on that definition. But also, a person who cultivates or has in his possession not more than 4 growing male plants of the genus Cannabis. Because you see, that is an area of major consumption, whether we like it or not. That there are a lot of persons in St. Lucia who grow marijuana and who use marijuana to produce teas of varying kinds. I remember, Mr. Speaker, I was horrified, one day in my constituency office in Beaufort South, that a gentleman came to me, and you know, Mr. Speaker, he was lamenting how difficult the times were, and that he was unable to send his children to school. Now, when you see it comes to children, Mr. Speaker, I have a huge issue. I have a really huge issue with parents who cannot tend to the needs of their children, send their children to school. So I said to him, but how are you coping? And he said to me, you know, sometimes he can't afford to buy tea for them or to make tea for them. And he sometimes makes marijuana tea and gives to the child. I looked at him and I said, but you're crazy. Of course, he wasn't offended because I knew him very well. And he says to me, boss man, that's all I have at the time as a child. Now, I mean, that's a highly dangerous thing to do because it will have consequences. And this touches on the issue of use and misuse, which I shall come to, Mr. Speaker, in a few minutes, regarding the underlying philosophy of the legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm saying that I think it would have been good if we could have taken the opportunity to see whether we can include a section that allows a person to cultivate 3 or 4 plants next to their home for whatever purposes that they need it for, whether it is, for example, as I indicated, for medicinal or for medical uses. Because whether you like it or not, there are a lot of people right now growing marijuana beside their homes. I mean, you just have to go, I mean, come on. You just have to go throughout the length and breadth of communities in St. Lucia, and you see marijuana plants being carefully tended and carefully looked after, and, you know, properly manured, and they're blossoming, Mr. Speaker. And I was teasing the member for Swazel Saltibus a while ago, and part of the reason why I was teasing him was that I know that he has interest in seeing industry decriminalized and that an industry be created. But you know why, Mr. Speaker? Because there's no question that in parts of his constituency, there are major producers. Yeah, no question. And he's blessed, and I am blessed, Mr. Speaker, too, because the area where we live, I mean, it has some of the best fertile soils in the country. So production, Mr. Speaker, is rampant in certain parts. Yes. Yes. The thing is this, that we in the South, we are producers and others are consumers. And if I may tell a member for Castries East, it is far more important to be a producer than a consumer. So we need to understand the value and the logic of production.
Member for Vieux-Fort Sava, I just wish to alert you, I'm not sure parliamentary privilege will immunize you from assisting the police.
Of course, Mr. Speaker. And you know, Mr. Speaker, whatever I say in this house is sacrosanct, is sacred. And it is true. I notice the policemen who are in this house are watching me intently as if to say, I wonder where next he's going to. So, Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that the ingenuity of the Attorney General will allow him to look at the legislation from Trinidad, and perhaps at committee stage we are able to insert a provision that will allow for this, because if you can do this, then it will resolve a problem at the other chain, because at the other end of the chain. I mean, you can't tell a fellow, okay, you're going to have your 30 grams, when in truth and in fact, a lot of the persons who are consumers happen to be the very same ones growing 4 or 5 plants next to their homes. I mean, could you imagine the implications of this, Mr. Speaker? I will cast no aspersions, Mr. Speaker. I hear those in this House who have said that they've never smoked marijuana in their life. They don't intend to smoke marijuana in their life. And this is not a season of admissions on this. Don't look at me, Mr. Speaker, because I have never smoked marijuana myself. But I know of persons who are consumers of teas and other byproducts made from marijuana. And I think we need to set those persons as well. And perhaps in this regard, we should definitely look at the legislation in Trinidad and Tobago. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where that term came from, Mr. Speaker, whether it's a film or just one of those odd comments in the passage of conversation. Eyes wide open. Is it a film, Mr. Speaker? Eyes Wide Open. Is it the name of a film or something? Huh? No. Eyes Wide Open, that I know. I don't know about Eyes Wide Shut. That's impossible. You can only have eyes wide open. Oh. I say this, Mr. Speaker, just to make a point. That we are taking this historical step, a momentous step And as I said, the things that should be accorded to history, for my part, I'll leave it for the next round of the debate. But we need to understand that once persons are allowed to use marijuana without facing the sanctions of law, and that is, they fall within the four corners of legislation, meaning the 30 grams. Once that occurs, Mr. Speaker, there is bound to be an increase in consumption. We have to face reality, Mr. Speaker. And I'm hoping, like every member, Mr. Speaker, that the fact that you can have in your possession 30 grams would temper the temptation to use it in unauthorized places, in much the same way as I think it is a member for Castries South was indicating, that in respect to cigarettes, that we are moving in the direction of banning the use of cigarettes in big places. So, you know, there's a good basis. But what I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to begin to prepare in the short term for if an increase in the consumption of marijuana, and two things are going to be required. One, more investment will have to be put into substance abuse to deal with the issue of substance abuse. And secondly, we would need to ensure that we have the kind of honest warnings to the population at large, in much the same way that we are able to say to the population at large, smoking is dangerous for your health because it can cause cancer. We must also be free and frank to be able to say, if you abuse the consumption of marijuana, there can be potential implications. These are the implications. That's what I meant, Mr. Speaker, when I said eyes wide open, so that we understand what we are into and we are not taken by any surprise. So at the appropriate time, I am hoping to see a fairly significant increase in resources, both at the financial end of it, but also in the expertise that is available to allow the treatment of persons who consume unnecessary amounts of cannabis and who get into difficulty. And let's not pretend it can't happen. It will happen. Other countries that have moved in that direction have had the problem in the short term. But the good news is, Mr. Speaker, that after a time levels out, and then as people get accustomed to what would be a reasonable use of cannabis, then it levels off and they consume amounts that do not cause any injury to their health. That's my point, Mr. Speaker. That's my point. So we need not throw our arms up in despair. It is a short-term cost. It has short-term consequences. But of course, the benefits far overwhelm whatever consequences you have. And so, as I said, subject to my hope that at this stage we can make an amendment to allow for the for those who cultivate at least 3 or 4 trees beside their homes, that they do not have to face the law in that regard. If we can do that in today's sitting, then that would be welcome. If not, of course, we'll have to wait to some future date. But just to say that this is a perfect time to do this, to accommodate this particular amendment. Mr. Speaker, I certainly welcome this legislation on behalf of my constituency, BF4 South, and I thank you.
Member for Babano.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, let me take brief leave from this discussion for a minute or two to express my condolences to some of my people in Abono. In my immediate community, I witnessed the death of a very close friend of mine through COVID. And the Charles family, then we have other families within my family who are falling one after the other. And it is a very sad moment for us. We have the Charles family, we have the Edward family, the Anthony family, the Flood family, the Elite family. And I want to express condolences to the Jamari family from outside of Babolo and our famous media personnel, the late Valerie Albert Favrier. It is a sad moment for us. Notwithstanding this, we have to press on. I yield to my senior colleagues earlier. We normally like women first, but we always say not in the time of war, because we have to stay back to care for the young and the elderly. Or we may not want to face the heavy artillery. But I yielded. But colleague, former Prime Minister, Beaufort South representative, former president of the Teachers Union, we go way back. So it's good to yield to your senior. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Drug Prevention of Misuse Amendment Bill as presented in this Honorable House. I have been challenged by some of my constituents and colleagues out there to say there's very little excitement in this House because they are not seeing much opposition. So we have to deal with our opposition as our constituents out there. They are listening and they have their own views. I am very pleased, Mr. Speaker, to know that government is moving in earnest to get the job done. And my constituents of Babono is very happy that the Labour government is waging a battle against COVID and a number of other issues that we found at our doorstep. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to work with a government and a leader who care about people and their welfare. My government, the new government of Lucia, is one with the will. We may not have the money, but we have the will and the fortitude to do what is right for the people of St. Lucia. And this is why we are putting them first. Putting you first. I stand by that slogan. This bill, Mr. Speaker, is one that has long been overdue. Some persons on the opposite and those on the outside will dissect the bill and argue that they started the process and they did this and they did that. I'm happy my colleague from Beaufort South set the record straight on the historical background of this bill. I know people are asking for more, but sometimes half a loaf is better than none. At least we are on our way. Mr. Speaker, the argument here today is that the St. Lucia Labour Party government, my government, under the leadership of Honorable Prime Minister, Philip J. Pierre, and my colleagues on this side of the House, we have the guts and the courage to finish this, and that is to take this bill to this House. And that is why we are called labor, because you have to go into labor before you can deliver. And we are about to deliver step by step to bring some kind of relief to our citizens in St. Lucia. The finishing line of the race is the most important part. That's how you determine the winner. And to bring this bill to this House is a step in the right direction. And when I watch Usain Bolt, and when he tracks the field, and even when he does the relay, he participates in the relay, they normally put him at the last end so that he can cross the line or add the extra energy to complete and to win. And this is what this government is doing. All the good things that have started in Lucia, we are there to complete, to cross the line. Mr. Speaker, that is the type of confidence the people of St. Lucia have in the men and women in this government. Mr. Speaker, this bill is not an easy bill to pass, no matter how trivial some people may look at it, but it has its challenges as articulated by my fellow colleagues. There are many different stories around the passage of this bill. I recall about a year and a half ago, I participated in a discussion in Babono on the Cannabis Commission. And after my presentation at the discussion, I was hailed the hero. The participants, the chairman of the commission, and those who have been advocating for the decriminalization of cannabis, they were quite pleased. But one thing I recall I said was that the Labour Party government, on assuming office, would address that bill. And I'm proud today to know that this bill is here for discussion by the government of the St. Lucia Labour Party. After this bill was tabled in this House, at the last sitting, an elderly man came to my home, and he was all agitated, and he started accusing me and my government for taking this bill. Well, I had to engage him. And I put on my teacher, my principal, my educator cap, and we had a long discussion. At the end of the exercise, he was quite pleased because I was able to defend that bill and explain to him what the intricacies of this bill and how it stands to benefit the ordinary people out there. And what he was pleased about was when I told him that this bill does not support smoking cannabis or marijuana in public, in people's faces. It does not allow that. He argued that this will increase the criminal activity in St. Lucia. And I heard some of my colleagues spoke earlier, Mr. Speaker, that we have alcohol in abundance on the shelves, but not everybody drinks. I go to the supermarket, I take my trolley, I buy fruits, vegetables, milk, eggs, oats, a lot of healthy foods, and I pass the aisle alcohol straight. Not that I don't have the money to buy it, but I chose not to buy it. So we asked our people in St. Lucia to exercise their discretion and to do what they think is right for them. So by decriminalizing cannabis does not give a license for people to use it in excess of what they think is right. Mr. Speaker, we do not promote misuse of drugs. And the misuse of drugs has always been at odds with the law. What is important is to exercise control to ensure those drugs that have medicinal values are used in the proper way. In the discussion in Babolo with the Cannabis Commission, it was there I learned. I had a very good lesson. I learned a lot. I will not come here and say, well, I have not used it and whatever. That's not for the records. But I'm yet to experiment on it. I have never used it. I said I'm yet to experiment. I'm not thinking about it. The experience is yet to come. It may never come. But having listened to the discussion at the Cannabis Commission, they did explain that some of the dangers in using this drug is because of lack of knowledge, lack of education. People don't understand how to use it. And therefore, by decriminalizing it opens the door for us to engage in aggressive education so that our people will understand the benefits of this drug. Mr. Speaker, we have many persons in our correctional facility in St. Lucia. And my last discussion with the director as Minister of Home Affairs painted a dim picture where he indicated that right now we have approximately 500 inmates at Bodley, and it is beyond this capacity. He also indicated that he sees a trend of young persons being admitted at Bodley. And he was also very worried that most of the young persons who were recently admitted to the institution, a large percentage of them came from the Boys Training Center. That is worrisome. He said out of 50, 48 of them had been at the Boys Training Center. Now, with small quantities of cannabis as it is on our laws today, many persons have landed themselves, Mr. Speaker, in our correctional facility. And the presence there is a serious cost to the government. Millions of dollars are spent to keep these people behind. Millions of dollars are spent for our officers to get them to adhere to the law or to bring them to justice. So I am seeing very clearly that this amendment to the bill will assist in regularizing some of these issues and will begin to start emptying the cup that flows into Bodley and cause it to overflow. We need to close on the pipe. We need to dig a hole under it, I said, to drain some of what is in it. And we have to who are busy night and day, as we said earlier, in trying to keep law and order. We need to congratulate them. And in my discussion with the Police Welfare Association, a lot of their issues are coming forward. Mr. Speaker, I will be visiting the Borderley Correctional Facility shortly to engage management and explore how we can improve the situation of our citizens who have found themselves at odds with the law. The government, as I said, cannot afford to spend millions and millions of dollars on issues we could have regularized in this House. A lot of taxpayers' money goes into correction. Mr. Speaker, my government is about reform, it's about change, it's about betterment. Anything that is better for the people, we will endeavor to engage in that. And I see the decriminalization of cannabis is a step in the right direction. I have listened to my colleagues, and the arguments are very strong. We correct things by using positive incentives. Many times we see negative, or punishment, or prosecution. But here, we have to begin to explore how do we engage in positive behavior. And I heard my colleague earlier spoke on COVID-19 and giving rewards for persons who decide to do the right thing, persons who decide to take the vaccine. We will reward them. We will show them that they're doing the right thing, and that will encourage positive behavior. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy that this bill does not encourage smoking in public. And I had discussion with a very famous business person in my constituency. And I told her, this bill will require that you have a space for people to smoke. And she was happy, Mr. Speaker, to tell me that she has a no smoking sign in her bar. So that's already taking care of those who may choose or would have liked to smoke freely in that public space. Mr. Speaker, I'm also happy that this bill protects our young generation, where persons below the age of 18 will not be allowed or not covered under this law. Because our children, they are our future. Our youth, they are our future. And we need to guide them. We need to give them the necessary support that they need to adjust to changes, to adjust behavior, and to do what is right. Mr. Speaker, I did mention that our law enforcement officers are articulated earlier by my colleagues, that they need to focus on the issues that are of critical importance for safety, protection, and keeping law and order. And the more we can minimize the effort, the energy in addressing things that could have been addressed by the law, the better for them. Mr. Speaker, I understand and I appreciate the value of this legislation. And I will concur with some of my colleagues who articulated earlier that what is fundamental for us now as we move forward is education. We need to educate our people so that they develop a greater appreciation for this bill. We need to educate the elderly we need to educate the youth. Generation divide. And we have to continue the crusade. We have to continue the campaign so that our people in St. Lucia will develop a greater appreciation for this bill. Our Rastafarian, as mentioned earlier, who have suffered serious consequences in the absence of this bill. They have been calling for whatever form. I was listening to the news and I heard the president articulating that the bill is not going far enough. But as I said, half a loaf is better than one. We are already moving in the direction so that we can get things right. Mr. Speaker, I stand to support this bill and I look forward to its full implementation. I look forward to its passage in this House. And I want to associate with my colleagues who have seen the wisdom in putting this bill forward as we continue to represent the people of St. Lucia the best of our ability. With this, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your patience.
Leader of Government Business and member for Castries South.
Hold on. I won't be long, you know. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Member for Castries Central.
Thank you. Come in. Don't worry about it. Come with it. Come with it. Come. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know it's this time of day when we say colloquially the Kong strikes. It would be remiss of me, Mr. Speaker, not to lend my voice in support of this amendment today, albeit for a very, very short while. And I told my colleagues I will be no more than between 5 and 10 minutes. And I know the member of Castries North will hold me to that. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by asking this. Over the last 3 sittings or thereabout, we have seen the member for Swazel Saltibus conspicuously occupying a chair that has been designed historically for the leader of the opposition. I wanted to ask Mr. Speaker whether this chamber, this August chamber, was in receipt of some kind of excuse from the member for Miku North. I ask Mr. Speaker, Miku South, sorry. I ask Mr. Speaker, because on the last occasion we dealt with the expungement of records in relation to possession of drugs. Today we are going a step further. Mwevle deja de wiso esyo pa kafi me marijuana. Mwevle deja de wiso ektioshe esla pani isyo.
Member for Castries Central, your comments must be directed to the House and not those externally.
Very well, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the people of Tiroche, Deriso, and the environs, and Lacouville, whether they do not have children who are incarcerated on drug charges. I want to ask whether they are not interested in the decriminalization of 30 grams or less of marijuana. Where is their representative to be present in this house advancing their cause? But that's for another show. Because last week, on the last occasion, when we dealt with the decriminalization, we dealt with the expungement, sorry. There are two scenarios that I wanted to bring to the attention of this honorable house, which I did not have the opportunity to do at the time, rather, or I didn't have it at my disposal at the time. But there was a civil rights activist in the U.S., Marion Barry. He was an activist and he served 3 terms as the mayor of the District of Columbia. He survived a drug arrest and also survived a jail sentence and came back to win a 4th term. He was arrested on January 18th, 1990 for crack cocaine. He still became mayor after that. The Colorado governor last year, October 1st, Mr. Speaker, he expunged 2,700 marijuana convictions. Last year as well, the governor of Illinois announced 500,000 expungement and pardons in relation to marijuana possession. So we are moving in the right direction, Mr. Speaker. As to the adequacy of the legislation, we know that this is work in the making. By no means this can completely address the ills that we are currently confronted with today. But we are moving in the right direction, and as my colleague from Miku, from Viewfort North, Viewfort South, sorry, I do believe that in the committee stage, Mr. Speaker, we need to make some kind of amendment to ensure that at least the 3 or 4 plants alluded to will be given the green light, so to speak. So at least those persons, for now, until the other areas of the industry are addressed legally, that those persons who want to consume their 30 grams can actually grow their 30 grams. Mr. Speaker, law is evolving. It is not static, it's dynamic. And today, apart from decriminalization, apart from the expungement, we are moving in the direction of decriminalization. As a practicing lawyer, Mr. Speaker, I always wondered what was the justification? What was the justification for legislating that a herb that can be grown almost anywhere, should be made illegal? Why? I did not understand. I never understood the rationale, and not up to today. Because laws that were on the books from time immemorial, as my colleague from Cannabis, Castro is what you represented? Northeast, Southeast, South, I put you in Guy's territory. As my, as my colleague from Castro South indicated, Mr. Speaker, up to 1952, the legislation did not permit the average St. Lucian to vote. You ought to have been the owner of land, or you ought to have owned assets. Today we enjoy universal adult suffrage, which we all take for granted. And although our ancestors fought for that right, which were on our law books, we take that back, we take that right and do what the very oppressive law had us to do back in 1952. Giving the authority to the colonialists. But those are things, Mr. Speaker, that were on the books. Gambling, Mr. Speaker, gambling was on the books. I remember as a young police officer, I remember the definition well, to play a game of chance for money or money's worth. Today we have institutionalized gambling so much that it serves of revenue for the government of St. Lucia. We collect money from gambling. That is how dynamic legislation is, and that is how legislation ought to meet the needs of the current time. Mr. Speaker, I must commend again the member for Viewfort South on his very instructive and factual presentation. And I must say he brought a lot of historical perspective into what we are doing here today. Mr. Speaker, I support the amendment. I know, as he indicated, there are vultures out there who are waiting for the law to be fixed in its entirety so that they can capitalize. They can capitalize on what they believe would be a multi-million-dollar market. They are there. Trust me, they are listening, and they are awaiting. They are awaiting the legislation being basically put in place for the entire industrialization of the marijuana industry. But as my colleague indicated, the small farmer should never, ever be forgotten. Mr. Speaker, I promise to take no more than 5 minutes, and my colleague from Castries North has indicated that it's now 7 minutes, so I believe I've outlived my useless insofar as the podium is concerned. Mr. Speaker, the others have echoed my sentiments, and I just wanted to ensure that my voice is on record as supporting this amendment to this bill. So I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of Government Business, a member of Castries South.
Mr. Speaker, I move that this House do now adjourn until 2:15.
Honourable members, the question is that this House stands suspended until 2:15. I now put the question. As many of that opinion, say aye. As many of the contrary opinion, no. I think the ayes have it. Ayes have it. House is suspended until 2:15.
All right.
And we're now seeing the exit of the Honorable Speaker of the House of Assembly, Honorable Claudius Francis, has made his exit, and the House has suspended until for the next hour for lunch. And primus, what we've been hearing, it's been the contribution from the various members of the House with regard to the Drugs Prevention of Misuse Amendment Act, and in there discussing the amendment and for the increase in the allowance personal use of for cannabis and upward of 30 grams. We also had very early in the day's proceedings, we did have a statement from the Prime Minister on the St. Jude Hospital reconstruction project. The Prime Minister there giving a very comprehensive report on a recent tour of that reconstruction site by members of Cabinet, and the Prime Minister did make available figures concerning the cost of that project.
Thanks, Lisa. I just quite enlightening the question of the drug amendment to do with cannabis. This has been long in the making, and the members, the government side, gave their full support to the bill, and it appears that we are closer to making it a reality as that bill is concerned. Timwe Edisa Koyol Vitma, side gouvernement, you presenté bill là à sous service marijuana et qui manière qu'a regardé pour ouais qui ça venu en service société côté en petite portion côté monde qui ça servi en petite portion en caillou pas pour servir en public mais en caillou même et aussi pour tout le monde qui était trouvé coordonné pour service marijuana, il y a effacé ça sur livre à payer. Alors, à dans un chemin pour pousser service marijuana comme industrie à cette ci. Ça c'est un qui a changé toute façon de sa loi marijuana déjà avant. Et aussi pour ça élever aussi pour ça faire un manière pour monde qui en balage protéger aussi pour pas servir marijuana. Nous croyons que ça c'est en bonne direction. Lisa.
Merci à Bill Primus for ça. And just say that Vast will continue within the next hour when the House reconvenes. Alongside Primus Hutchinson, I am Sir Joseph.